The Hargroves and the Velasquez families, to all outward appearances, were living the American dream. Their manicured lawns and hybrid cars in the driveways gave no hint of the tempest brewing behind closed doors. Liam and Rachel Hargrove had been college sweethearts, married for 15 years. Liam, a software engineer for a local tech startup, was known for his dry wit and passion for homebrewing. Rachel, a pediatric nurse, volunteered at the neighborhood watch and was always ready with a plate of her famous lavender shortbread for new neighbors. They were the couple others looked to as a model of stability and success. Just 2 doors down lived Rafael and Marisol Velasquez. Rafael, a charismatic restaurateur, had moved from Mexico City a decade ago to open what would become the hottest fusion taqueria. His wife Marisol, a yoga instructor and part-time translator, was beloved for her vibrant energy and warm hugs. Their whirlwind romance had culminated in a beachside wedding in Tulum just 5 years prior. The two couples had become fast friends shortly after the Velasquez moved in, bonding over weekend barbecues and a shared love for wineries. They vacationed together and celebrated holidays as a unit. To their friends and neighbors, they were the picture of modern multicultural friendship. But beneath the surface of potlucks and game nights, a current of restlessness was growing, a longing for excitement, for newness, for the spark that had faded in the routines of married life. It was this unspoken desire that would lead them down a path from which there was no return. The idea first surfaced on a crisp autumn evening, as the 4 friends lounged in the Hargroves' hot tub, steam rising into the star-studded sky. The wine had been flowing freely, loosening tongues and lowering inhibitions. Rafael, always the jokester, had made a quip about wife-swapping that hung in the air a beat too long before nervous laughter dispersed it. But the seed had been planted. Over the next few weeks, the joke resurfaced, each time met with less laughter and more contemplative silence. It was Rachel who finally broached the subject seriously. During one of the couple's regular dinner dates, "We're all adults here," she began, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands beneath the table. "Maybe there's something to this idea, a way to spice things up." The silence that followed was deafening. Marisol's eyes widened, darting between her husband and friends. Liam stared intently at his plate. It was Rafael who broke the tension, his usual grin replaced by a look of thoughtful consideration. The conversation that followed lasted deep into the night. Boundaries were discussed, scenarios explored, concerns voiced. Liam, initially the most hesitant, found himself warming to the idea as the others talked through the logistics. Marisol, surprisingly, was the most enthusiastic once the initial shock wore off. "It's just physical, right?" she said, her dark eyes sparkling with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "No feelings involved, a temporary arrangement to explore and then return to our partners." They agreed to think it over individually, and as couples before making any decisions. The next week was filled with hushed conversations behind closed doors, furtive glances across the street, and more than one sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling, imagining possibilities. When they reconvened, the decision was unanimous if tentative. They would try it, just once to see how it felt. Rules were established. A 1-month time frame, complete honesty with their original partners, and the freedom to call it off at any time if anyone felt uncomfortable. As they raised their glasses to seal the agreement, none of them could have foreseen the tragedy that would unfold from this moment of adventurous curiosity. The die was cast, and the wheel of fate had begun to turn. The agreed-upon evening arrived with a palpable tension in the air. The Hargroves' home, usually a warm and inviting space, felt charged with an electric anticipation. Liam had spent the afternoon obsessively cleaning, a nervous habit that manifested whenever he felt out of his depth. Rachel, meanwhile, had changed outfits no less than 5 times before settling on a simple black dress that hugged her curves. Across the street, Rafael and Marisol prepared with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Rafael, ever the showman, had set out candles and opened a bottle of expensive tequila he'd been saving for a special occasion. Marisol moved through her son's salutations, trying to center herself and calm the butterflies in her stomach. At precisely 8 p.m., as agreed, Rachel made the short walk to the Velasquez home. Her heart pounded with each step, a mixture of guilt and exhilaration coursing through her veins. Rafael greeted her at the door with a warm smile and a glass of tequila, which she accepted gratefully. Meanwhile, Marisol arrived at the Hargroves, a vision in a flowing red dress that seemed to accentuate her every movement. Liam, usually so composed, found himself fumbling with the wine opener, suddenly acutely aware of Marisol's presence in a way he'd never been before. The initial moments were awkward, filled with stilted small talk and nervous laughter. But as the alcohol flowed and the reality of their situation set in, the atmosphere began to shift. Raphael, ever the charmer, regaled Rachel with stories of his childhood, each tale bringing him physically closer to her on the couch. Rachel found herself captivated, not just by the stories, but by the passion with which he told them, so different from Liam's reserved nature. Across the street, Liam and Marisol had moved from the living room to the kitchen, where Marisol insisted on teaching Liam how to properly make guacamole. The simple act of chopping avocados became an intimate dance, their hands brushing against each other. As the night progressed, inhibitions lowered and desires rose to the surface. Raphael's hand found its way to Rachel's thigh, and she surprised herself by not pulling away. In the Hargrove kitchen, Liam found himself mesmerized by the graceful curves of Marisol. The transition from social interaction to physical intimacy was both abrupt and natural. A lingering look, a tentative touch, and suddenly they were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Clothes were shed, breaths quickened, and in the dim light of bedrooms usually shared with other partners, new connections were forged. In the aftermath, as they lay in unfamiliar beds beside familiar friends, each participant grappled with a complex mix of emotions. Guilt, excitement, confusion, and a strange sense of loss all mingled together. As they drifted off to sleep, none of them realized that this night had set in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. For in the dim light of the Hargrove bedroom, Liam had looked into Marisol's eyes and felt something stir within him that went far beyond the physical boundaries they had agreed upon. In the days following the swap, life in the Laurelhurst neighborhood seemed to return to its usual rhythm. Liam went back to his coding, Rachel to her patients, Raphael to his restaurant, and Marisol to her yoga studio. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, a subtle shift had occurred, particularly within Liam Hargrove. At first, the changes were almost imperceptible. Liam found himself lingering a little longer at the window, his gaze drifting towards the Velasquez home. He began taking more frequent walks, timing them to coincide with Marisol's return from her yoga classes. His usual playlist of tech podcasts was replaced by the Latin music Raphael had introduced him to, the rhythms reminding him of Marisol. As weeks passed, these small changes became more pronounced. Liam's colleagues at the startup noticed his distraction, his usual laser focus on code, replaced by long periods of staring blankly at his screen. He began learning Spanish using a language app, telling Rachel it was for an upcoming project at work. Late at night, when sleep eluded him, he found himself scrolling through old photos on his phone, lingering on group pictures where Marisol's smile seemed to outshine everything else. Liam tried to rationalize these feelings, to suppress the growing emotional attachment he felt towards Marisol. He reminded himself of the agreement, of the boundaries they had set. This was supposed to be a one-time thing, a purely physical exploration. But in quiet moments, he couldn't deny the warmth that spread through his chest when he thought of her laugh, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. The internal struggle began to manifest externally. Liam became irritable, snapping at Rachel over small issues. He threw himself into work, staying late at the office to avoid the temptation of seeking out Marisol's company. When the two couples did get together, Liam's behavior oscillated between overly attentive to Marisol and completely avoiding her, drawing curious glances from both Rachel and Raphael. One evening, as Liam lay awake beside a sleeping Rachel, the full weight of his emotions crashed over him. He realized, with a mix of exhilaration and horror, that he was falling in love with Marisol. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. He knew he should end it, should confess to Rachel and distance himself from Marisol, but the mere idea of never being close to her again felt like a physical pain in his chest. As dawn broke, Liam made a decision. He would try harder to suppress these feelings, to be the husband Rachel deserved. But even as he resolved this, a small part of him whispered that it was already too late. The seed of desire had been planted, and it was growing into something that couldn't be easily uprooted. As autumn gave way to winter, the once warm and easy friendship between the two couples began to cool. The change was subtle at first, manifesting in canceled plans and shorter, less frequent interactions. But as weeks passed, the tension became palpable.
a silent presence at every gathering. Rachel was the first to notice the shift in her husband's behavior. Liam, once an open book to her, had become distant and guarded. She caught him checking his phone more frequently, his face lighting up at certain notifications before quickly schooling his features back to neutrality. When she asked about his day, his answers became vague and evasive. During one of their now rare dinners with the Velasquez, Rachel couldn't help but notice the way Liam's eyes followed Marisol's every movement. Raphael, usually jovial and laid back, began to exhibit signs of stress. His legendary patience in the kitchen shortened, and staff at his restaurant whispered about his uncharacteristic outbursts. At home, he became possessive of Marisol in a way he'd never been before, questioning her about her daily activities and suggesting they spend less time with the Hargroves. Marisol, caught in the middle, found herself torn between her growing affection for Liam and her commitment to Raphael. She tried to maintain normalcy, suggesting double dates and neighborhood gatherings like before, but each interaction was fraught with unspoken tensions and loaded glances. The breaking point came at a neighborhood block party in early December. As holiday lights twinkled on every house, the four found themselves together for the first time in weeks. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by long silences and forced laughter. When Marisol excused herself to get a drink, Liam immediately offered to help, leaving Rachel and Raphael alone. Rachel, her suspicions finally boiling over, confronted Raphael. "Is there something going on between them?" she demanded, her voice low but intense. Raphael, his own jealousy and fears rising to the surface, lashed out defensively. "Maybe you should ask your husband that," he snapped back. Their heated exchange drew the attention of other partygoers, and by the time Liam and Marisol returned, they found their spouses in a tense standoff. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of awkward apologies and hasty goodbyes. That night in both households, long-avoided conversations finally took place. Accusations were made, denials issued, and tears shed. Rachel demanded answers from Liam, her voice cracking as she asked if he was in love with Marisol. Liam's hesitation before his denial was all the confirmation she needed. Across the street, Raphael's jealousy exploded into a rage that left Marisol shaken. His accusations of betrayal and demands for the truth echoed through their home, a jarring contrast to the peaceful life they'd built. As the night wore on, all four individuals grappled with the realization that their simple agreement had spiraled into something far more complicated and potentially destructive. The foundation of trust that had supported their friendships and marriages was crumbling, and in its place, a volatile mix of love, jealousy, and resentment was taking root. January 15th dawned cold and gray, a thick fog hanging over the town like a portent of the tragedy to come. The weeks following the block party confrontation had been tense, with both couples retreating into themselves, communication reduced to terse texts and avoided glances across the street. That evening, Liam sat in his home office, ostensibly working late but in reality lost in thoughts of Marisol. The sound of the front door opening and closing jolted him from his reverie. Rachel's voice, tight with barely controlled emotion, called out his name. In the living room, Liam found not just Rachel but Raphael and Marisol as well. The atmosphere was charged, Raphael's face a mask of barely contained fury, Marisol's eyes red-rimmed and pleading. Rachel stood apart, her posture rigid, arms crossed defensively across her chest. "We need to talk," Rachel began, her voice trembling slightly. "All of us. This has gone on long enough." What followed was a maelstrom of emotions, years of friendship, and months of hidden feelings exploding into the open. Raphael accused Liam of pursuing Marisol, of trying to steal her away. Rachel, tears streaming down her face, demanded to know how long the affair had been going on. Marisol, caught between her growing feelings for Liam and her loyalty to Raphael, tried desperately to calm the situation. Liam, overwhelmed by the onslaught, initially retreated into denial. But as the accusations flew and emotions heightened, something inside him snapped. In a moment of reckless honesty, he confessed his feelings for Marisol, his words cutting through the chaos like a knife. Raphael, his face contorting with rage, lunged at Liam. The two men grappled, years of friendship evaporating in an instant as fists flew and furniture toppled. Rachel screamed for them to stop, her pleas drowned out by the sounds of the struggle. Marisol tried to intervene, attempting to pull Raphael away, but was shoved aside in the chaos. In the frenzy, no one noticed Raphael's hand closing around a heavy crystal vase. It wasn't until the sickening thud of crystal meeting flesh and bone echoed through the room
that everything froze. Liam crumpled to the ground, blood pooling rapidly around his head. The vase slipped from Raphael's hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. For a moment, no one moved, the scene before them too horrific to comprehend. It was Rachel who broke the paralysis, her nurse's training kicking in as she rushed to Liam's side. Her fingers frantically sought a pulse as she barked orders at the others to call 911. Marisol, shaking uncontrollably, fumbled with her phone, her tear-blurred vision making it hard to dial. Raphael stood motionless, his face a mask of shock and disbelief at what he had done. The sound of sirens in the distance broke through the haze, snapping him back to the horrifying reality of the situation. Paramedics arrived minutes later, but their efforts were in vain. Liam Hargrove was pronounced dead at the scene, his life extinguished in a moment of uncontrolled passion. As police cars pulled up, their flashing lights illuminating the quiet street, neighbors emerged from their homes drawn by the commotion. In the chaos that followed, statements were taken, evidence collected. Raphael, still in a state of shock, offered no resistance as he was handcuffed and led to a waiting police car. As dawn broke, the idyllic facade of Laurelhurst had been shattered. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the morning breeze, a stark contrast to the well-manicured lawns and cheerful holiday decorations that still adorned some homes. The investigation into Liam Hargrove's death began in earnest the following morning. Detective Amelia Schaefer, a veteran of Homicide Division, took charge of the case, unaware of the shocking plot twist that was about to be revealed. Her first step was to separate the three survivors, each sequestered in a different interview room at the precinct. Rachel Hargrove, still in shock, provided a disjointed account of the evening's events. She spoke of the growing tension between the couples, the suspicions that had eaten away at her for weeks. Her description of the fatal confrontation was punctuated by bouts of sobbing and long haunted silences. Marisol Velasquez, visibly distraught, initially refused to speak without a lawyer present. When one arrived, she gave a tearful confession about the affair with Liam, insisting that it had been emotional rather than physical since the initial swap. She described Raphael's increasing jealousy and controlling behavior in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Raphael Velasquez, advised by his lawyer to remain silent, sat stoically through initial questioning. However, as the hours wore on and the gravity of his situation became clear, he broke down. In a moment of raw honesty, he admitted to striking Liam but insisted he never meant to kill him. It was an accident, he repeated over and over, his voice hoarse with emotion. As statements were taken, forensic teams combed through both the Hargrove and Velasquez residences. They uncovered a series of text messages between Liam and Marisol, revealing the depth of their emotional entanglement. Emails drafts found on Liam's computer showed he had been contemplating leaving Rachel, adding another layer to the tragedy. The murder weapon, the crystal vase, was sent to the lab for analysis. Fingerprints matched Raphael's, and traces of Liam's blood and hair were found embedded in the shattered pieces. The force required to cause such catastrophic injury was consistent with Raphael's build and the rage described by witnesses. Neighbors were interviewed, painting a picture of two couples who had once been the cornerstone of the community. Many expressed shock, unable to reconcile the violent act with the friendly, successful people they thought they knew. As the investigation progressed, Detective Schaefer began to piece together a timeline of events. The initial wife swap, intended as a one-time exploration, had sparked an emotional affair between Liam and Marisol. This, in turn, had led to mounting tensions and suspicions, culminating in the fatal confrontation. The case, initially seeming straightforward, grew more complex as layers of motivation and circumstance were revealed. As the first week of the investigation drew to a close, Detective Schaefer stood before a board covered in photos, timelines, and connecting threads. The facts were clear, but the full truth of what had transpired in the Hargrove living room that fateful night remained elusive. The case was far from closed, and the ripples of this tragedy would continue to spread through the lives of all involved. As the investigation deepened, Detective Schaefer and her team began to uncover layers of complexity that went beyond the surface narrative. Delving into the backgrounds of all four individuals involved revealed hidden motivations and long-buried secrets that cast the events in a new light. Liam Hargrove, it emerged, had a history of depression that he had carefully hidden from all but Rachel. Interviews with his colleagues revealed a man who had been struggling with his work in recent months, his usual passion for coding replaced by a listlessness that many had attributed to simple burnout. A deeper dive into his medical records showed a recent change in antidepressant medication, one that came with warnings about increased impulsivity and mood swings. Rachel's perfected image of the devoted wife and nurse also began to crack under scrutiny. Former co-workers spoke of her intense ambition, of opportunities for advancement she had passed up to support Liam's career. Some hinted at resentment that had been building for years, carefully hidden behind a facade of contentment. Her enthusiastic suggestion of the wife swap began to look less like a spontaneous idea and more like a calculated risk to shake up her stagnant marriage. Rafael Velasquez's charismatic exterior concealed a man haunted by insecurities. Immigration records revealed a complicated history, with Rafael having overstayed a student visa years ago before marrying Marisol and gaining legal status. This precarious past had left him with a deep-seated fear of losing everything he had built, manifesting in his recent controlling behavior towards Marisol. Perhaps most surprisingly, Marisol's image as the carefree yoga instructor belied a woman with hidden depths. A sealed juvenile record from her teenage years in California hinted at a troubled past she had worked hard to overcome. Friends from before her marriage to Rafael described a passionate, often reckless young woman who had seemingly transformed herself into the picture of stability upon moving to Portland. As these details came to light, the narrative of the case shifted. What had initially seemed a straightforward crime of passion revealed itself to be the culmination of years of unspoken tensions, secret struggles, and unfulfilled desires. The wife swap agreement, far from being the catalyst, now appeared to be merely the spark that had ignited a powder keg of suppressed emotions and hidden resentments. Detective Schaefer found herself grappling with a case that defied easy categorization. The lines between victim and perpetrator blurred, with each person involved bearing some measure of responsibility for the tragedy that had unfolded. The trial of Rafael Velasquez for the murder of Liam Hargrove began on a rainy Monday in late spring, nearly 6 months after the fatal confrontation. Rafael, looking gaunt and somber in a dark suit, was led in by his defense team. Rachel Hargrove, still wearing her grief like a shroud, entered flanked by supportive colleagues. Marisol, who would be testifying for both the prosecution and the defense, slipped in through a side entrance, her once vibrant presence dimmed by months of guilt and public scrutiny. Inside the courtroom, District Attorney laid out the prosecution's case. She painted a picture of Rafael as a man consumed by jealousy, who had lashed out in a premeditated act of violence. The crystal vase, she argued, had been grabbed with intent, the fatal blow delivered with the full force of Rafael's rage. In contrast, Rafael's defense team presented their client as a man pushed to the breaking point. They spoke of the sanctity of marriage, of the betrayal Rafael had suffered, and of the confrontation as a moment of temporary insanity rather than calculated murder. Over the next 3 weeks, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Forensic experts debated the force and angle of the fatal blow. Neighbors recounted the gradual shift in dynamics between the two couples. Colleagues and friends of both Liam and Rafael testified to their states of mind in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. As the trial neared its end, both the prosecution and defense made impassioned final arguments. The judge, taking into account Rafael's unique circumstances of the case, sentenced him to 18 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 12 years. The sentence was met with mixed reactions, some feeling it was too lenient, others believing it appropriately balanced justice with mercy. The Robbie family consisted of Ryan, a successful 45-year-old investment banker with penchant for Brooks Brothers suits, his second wife, Mandy, a striking 38-year-old interior designer with a flair for the dramatic, and Ryan's son from his first marriage, 20-year-old Nathaniel, a college dropout with a chip on his shoulder and a history of minor run-ins with the law. To their neighbors, the Robbies appeared to be living the American dream. Ryan's career was thriving. Mandy's design business was gaining traction among Oakdale's elite, and Nathaniel, despite his academic setbacks, seemed to be finding his footing working at a local garage. Little did anyone suspect that beneath this carefully cultivated image lay a powder keg of secrets, jealousies, and dangerous desires. Ryan Robbie's first marriage to Helena, Nathaniel's mother, had been a whirlwind romance that quickly soured. Helena, a free-spirited artist, found herself stifled by Ryan's rigid lifestyle and expectations. Their arguments, once confined to hushed whispers behind closed doors, escalated into shouting matches that echoed through their home, leaving a young Nathaniel cowering in his room. The divorce, when it came, was bitter and protracted. Helena fought for full custody, painting Ryan as a cold, neglectful father. In the end, the court granted joint custody, but the damage was done. Nathaniel, then only 10 years old at the time, was torn between two warring parents, his loyalty constantly tested. Helena's subsequent move to the West Coast for her art career left Nathaniel feeling abandoned, fueling a resentment that would smolder for years to come. Ryan threw himself into his work, climbing the corporate ladder with single-minded determination. It was at a charity gala, 3 years after his divorce, that he met Mandy Rossi. She was captivating, with her raven hair and quick wit, a breath of fresh air in Ryan's staid world. Mandy saw in Ryan not just financial security, but a chance at the stable family life she'd never had growing up in foster care. Their courtship was swift, and within a year, Mandy had moved into the Robbie home. Nathaniel, now 14 and in the throes of adolescent angst, viewed his new stepmother with suspicion and hostility. Mandy's attempts to bond with her stepson were met with cold indifference at best and open hostility at worst. As the years passed, the divide between Mandy and Nathaniel grew. Ryan, eager to avoid conflict, turned a blind eye to the tension, convincing himself that time would heal all wounds. Mandy, frustrated by her inability to connect with Nathaniel, gradually withdrew, focusing on her burgeoning design career and the social circles it opened up to her. Nathaniel's teenage years were marked by rebellion, skipping classes, experimenting with drugs, and petty theft. Each incident widened the chasm between him and his father, with Mandy often caught in the crossfire. By the time Nathaniel grudgingly enrolled in the local community college, the Robbie home had become a battleground of unspoken grievances and simmering resentments, setting the stage for the explosive events to come. The catalyst for the Robbie family's unraveling came on a sweltering July afternoon. Nathaniel, having dropped out of college and now working as a mechanic, returned home earlier than usual, nursing a hangover in a foul mood. The house was quiet, Ryan away on a business trip and Mandy presumably at a client meeting. Seeking aspirin for his pounding headache, Nathaniel entered the master bedroom, a space he usually avoided. As he rummaged through the medicine cabinet, a buzzing sound caught his attention. Mandy's phone, forgotten on the nightstand, lit up with a new message. Perhaps it was the lingering effects of the previous night's indulgences, or simply a malicious impulse, but Nathaniel found himself reaching for the device. The message preview on the lock screen made his eyes widen. "Can't wait to see you later, my love. Axir." His stepmother's phone was locked, but this single message was a key to a Pandora's box of secrets. Over the next hour, Nathaniel sat on his parents' bed, his headache forgotten as more messages arrived, each one more incriminating than the last. He learned that the sender was one Xavier Krasinski, a name he vaguely recognized as a client of Mandy's design business. The messages painted a vivid picture of a torrid affair that had been going on for months. There were references to clandestine meetings, passionate encounters, and promises of a future together. As the reality of his discovery sank in, a mix of emotions washed over Nathaniel. There was disgust at the thought of his stepmother's infidelity, a twisted sense of satisfaction at having ammunition against the woman he'd resented for years, and beneath it all, a spark of opportunity. When Mandy returned home that evening, she found Nathaniel waiting for her in the kitchen, an unsettling smirk playing on his lips. The air was charged with tension as he casually asked about her day, his eyes glinting with newfound knowledge. Mandy, sensing something amiss, answered cautiously, unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around her. Nathaniel wasted no time in revealing his hand. With a casualness that belied the weight of his words, he mentioned Xavier's name, watching as the color drained from Mandy's face. He laid out what he knew, savoring each flinch and gasp from his stepmother as he recounted the details of her affair. Mandy's initial denials quickly gave way to desperate pleas as Nathaniel made his intentions clear. He wanted money, $1,000 a month in exchange for his silence. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years he'd resented Mandy's presence in his life, and now he saw an opportunity to profit from it. Her voice shaking, Mandy tried to reason with him. She spoke of family loyalty, of the pain this would cause Ryan, of the potential to tear their lives apart. But Nathaniel was unmoved. With cold calculation, he pointed out that it was Mandy who had jeopardized their family with her infidelity. He was merely capitalizing on her mistake. The negotiations were tense, with Mandy trying to bargain the amount down and Nathaniel standing firm. In the end, faced with the prospect of losing everything, her marriage, her social standing, her carefully cultivated image, Mandy capitulated. She agreed to Nathaniel's terms, her voice hollow with defeat as she promised to make the first payment the following day. As Nathaniel left the kitchen, a sense of power surged through him. He had the upper hand for the first time in years, and he intended to make the most of it. Mandy, left alone, her mind racing as she grappled with the magnitude of her predicament. The first payment was made in cash, handed over in a plain envelope in the garage, away from prying eyes. Nathaniel counted the bills slowly, relishing Mandy's discomfort. With a smirk, he reminded her that this was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, a new dynamic took hold in the Robbie household. On the surface, little had changed. Ryan remained oblivious, absorbed in his work. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, a current of tension crackled. Mandy walked on eggshells, her once confident demeanor replaced by nervous glances and forced smiles. Nathaniel, emboldened by his newfound power, became more openly disrespectful, knowing Mandy wouldn't dare challenge him. As summer waned, the weight of her secret and the strain of meeting Nathaniel's demands began to take their toll on Mandy. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would spiral far beyond her control. As weeks turned into months, the fragile equilibrium in the Robbie home began to crumble. Nathaniel, intoxicated by his newfound power, grew bolder in his demands. The monthly payments, once a source of smug satisfaction, now seemed paltry compared to the control he wielded over his stepmother's life. It started small. Snide comments at the dinner table, thinly veiled threats disguised as innocent conversation. Nathaniel would casually mention Xavier's name in Ryan's presence, watching Mandy's face contort with panic before smoothly changing the subject. He reveled in her fear, in the way her hands would shake as she poured the wine, in the dark circles that began to form under her eyes as sleepless nights took their toll. By October, the original agreement no longer sufficed. Nathaniel cornered Mandy in the laundry room, demanding an increase to $1,500 a month. When Mandy protested, citing the difficulty of explaining the withdrawals to Ryan, Nathaniel's eyes hardened. He reminded her of the photos he'd discovered on her phone, intimate images never meant for his eyes, and how easily they could find their way to Ryan's inbox. Mandy's world was unraveling. The stress of maintaining her secret life with Xavier, coupled with Nathaniel's escalating blackmail, was pushing her to the brink. Her design business began to suffer as she missed appointments and turned in subpar work. Clients, once charmed by her vivacity, now complained about her distracted demeanor and lack of creativity. As autumn progressed, Nathaniel's demands extended beyond money. He began to treat the house as if it were his own, throwing parties when Ryan was away on business trips, leaving Mandy to clean up the aftermath. He borrowed Ryan's prized vintage car without permission, returning it with mysterious dents and scratches. Each transgression was met with a pointed look that silenced any protest Mandy might have mustered. The power dynamic in the house had shifted dramatically. Nathaniel now ruled the roost, his every whim catered to by an increasingly desperate Mandy. She found herself walking a tightrope, trying to meet Nathaniel's demands while maintaining the facade of normalcy for Ryan. As Thanksgiving approached, bringing with it the prospect of extended family gatherings and increased scrutiny, Mandy knew something had to give. She couldn't continue like this indefinitely. With growing dread, she realized she needed help, and there was only one person she could turn to. In early December, Mandy made a decision that would set in motion a chain of irreversible events. After weeks of agonizing, she confided in Xavier about the blackmail. The meeting took place in a nondescript motel on the outskirts of town, their usual rendezvous point. As Mandy poured out the whole sordid tale, her voice cracking with emotion, Xavier's expression darkened. His initial shock gave way to a cold, calculating anger that sent a chill down Mandy's spine. What Mandy didn't know that Xavier Krasinski was not merely the successful businessman and charming lover she believed him to be. Beneath his polished exterior lay a history of violence and criminal connections that he'd carefully concealed from her. Xavier's past included a stint in prison for aggravated assault, associations with local organized crime, and a reputation for handling problems with ruthless efficiency. As he listened to Mandy's story, wheels began turning in his mind. This wasn't just about protecting their relationship anymore. It was about eliminating a threat. He assured Mandy that he would take care of everything, his tone soothing but his eyes hard as flint. Mandy, desperate for a solution and blinded by her feelings for Xavier, felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, she thought, someone else would shoulder this burden. Over the next few days, Xavier set his plan in motion. He reached out to old contacts, gathering information on Nathaniel's habits, his workplace, his favorite haunts. He was meticulous in his planning, leaving nothing to chance. Unbeknownst to Mandy, Xavier had no intention of simply buying Nathaniel's silence or reasoning with him. In Xavier's world, problems like this were solved permanently, and collateral damage was an acceptable risk. As Christmas decorations began to appear in the windows of Oakdale's homes, Xavier made his move. He approached Nathaniel outside the garage where he worked, his demeanor friendly, but his eyes cold. The conversation that followed was brief, but loaded with unspoken threats. Xavier made it clear that he knew about the blackmail, and that Nathaniel was playing a dangerous game. Nathaniel, however, was not as easily cowed as Xavier had anticipated. Years of resentment and the taste of power had hardened him. Instead of backing down, he sneered at Xavier, suggesting that perhaps Ryan would be interested in knowing about his wife's extracurricular activities. As Xavier walked away, his genial mask slipping to reveal a flash of genuine anger, both knew that the stakes had just been raised exponentially. The game was no longer just about money or secrets. It had become a battle of wills, with potentially deadly consequences. The week before Christmas, Xavier decided to take more direct action. His warning to Nathaniel had fallen on deaf ears, and he knew that Mandy was at her breaking point. Under the guise of a pre-holiday drinks invitation, Xavier lured Nathaniel to a secluded area near the old mill on the outskirts of town. The winter air was crisp. He offered a substantial sum, $50,000, for Nathaniel to leave and never contact Mandy again. It was meant to be a final generous offer before resorting to more drastic measures. Nathaniel, however, had severely underestimated the danger he was in. Emboldened by months of successfully manipulating Mandy, he scoffed Xavier's offer. In a display of youthful arrogance, he countered with an outrageous demand, $250,000, or he'd expose both Mandy and Xavier to Ryan and the entire community. What happened next was a blur of motion and violence. Xavier, his patience exhausted, lashed out with a speed and ferocity that caught Nathaniel completely off guard. The ensuing struggle was brief but brutal. Xavier's experience and ruthlessness quickly overwhelmed Nathaniel, leaving the younger man battered and bloodied on the frozen ground. As Nathaniel lay there tasting blood and fear for the first time, Xavier delivered a final warning. This was his last chance to walk away, to forget everything he'd seen and heard. The next time, Xavier promised, there would be no warnings, no offers, only consequences. Shaken and in pain, Nathaniel stumbled home that night, his mind reeling. The reality of his situation had finally hit home. He was no longer the one in control. He was in over his head, tangled in a web far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. For a brief moment, as he nursed his wounds in the solitude of his room, Nathaniel considered taking Xavier's advice and disappearing. But as the pain of his injuries gave way to a burning anger, his resolve hardened. He wasn't going to be intimidated. If anything, this attack had only strengthened his determination to see this through to the end, whatever that might be. As Christmas approached, the atmosphere in the Robbie home grew increasingly tense. Mandy, already stretched to a breaking point, now had to contend with Nathaniel's escalating demands and increasingly erratic behavior. The bruises from his encounter with Xavier had faded, but his anger had only intensified. Ryan, no longer able to ignore the palpable tension, began asking more pointed questions. The cracks in Mandy's carefully constructed facade were beginning to show, and she found herself struggling to maintain the illusion of normalcy. It all came to a head on Christmas Eve. The Robbies were hosting their annual holiday party, the house filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. Mandy, dressed in a stunning dress, moved among the guests with practiced ease, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Nathaniel, sullen and nursing a whiskey in the corner, watched his stepmother with barely concealed contempt. As the night wore on and the alcohol flowed freely, his inhibitions lowered dangerously. In a moment of reckless anger, he approached Mandy as she chatted with some of Ryan's colleagues. Whispering in her ear, he demanded another payment, $5,000 this time, by the end of the week. When Mandy, her face pale but composed, tried to quietly reason with him, Nathaniel's control slipped. Mandy, her heart pounding, quickly excused herself and practically dragged Nathaniel to the study. Once there, she unleashed months of pent-up fear and frustration. In hushed but intense tones, she told Nathaniel that she was done. She wouldn't pay him anymore. If he wanted to tell Ryan, then so be it. She was tired of living under the weight of his threats. Nathaniel, caught off guard by her sudden defiance, lashed out verbally, threatening not just to expose her affair but to destroy her reputation, her marriage, her entire life. He stormed out of the study, leaving Mandy trembling but oddly relieved. She had finally stood up to him. Consequences be damned. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Mandy knew she had reached a point of no return. Something had to be done, and soon. With shaking hands, she reached for a phone and sent a text to Xavier. "We need to talk, it's urgent." January 15th dawned cold and gray, a fitting backdrop for the tragedy about to unfold. Mandy had spent the week since Christmas in a state of constant anxiety, jumping at every sound, flinching every time Nathaniel entered a room. Her conversation with Xavier had been brief but intense. He had listened to her desperate pleas, his face an unreadable mask, and simply said, "I'll take care of it." Those words, which had initially brought her relief, now haunted her. What exactly did Xavier mean? As much as she wanted an end to Nathaniel's blackmail, the thought of what that end might entail filled her with dread. Nathaniel, for his part, had been unusually quiet since the Christmas Eve confrontation. He seemed to be weighing his options, unsure of how to proceed now that Mandy had called his bluff. The uncertainty only added to the suffocating tension in the house. That evening, Ryan was working late, as he often did. Mandy sat in the living room, absently flipping through a magazine, her mind elsewhere. The sound of Nathaniel's car pulling into the driveway made her stiffen. She heard the front door open, his footsteps in the hall, then silence. Upstairs, Nathaniel entered his room, his mind made up. He was done playing games. Tomorrow, he would tell his father everything. Let the chips fall where they may. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching his door. The knock, when it came, startled him. Expecting Mandy, he opened the door with a sneer already forming on his lips. The sight of Xavier standing there, his expression grim, wiped the sneer away instantly. What happened next was a flurry of violence that lasted mere minutes, but would have repercussions for years to come. Xavier forced his way into the room, closing the door behind him. Words were exchanged. Threats, pleas, desperate bargaining. But Xavier hadn't come to negotiate. The first blow caught Nathaniel by surprise, sending him stumbling back against his desk. He fought back, his youth and desperation lending him strength. But Xavier's experience and cold determination proved too much. The struggle was brutal but brief. Downstairs, Mandy heard the muffled sounds of the fight, her heart racing. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, paralyzed by indecision and fear. A part of her knew she should intervene, call for help, do something. But another part, the part that had endured months of torment and blackmail, kept her rooted to the spot. The silence when it fell was deafening. Mandy's legs trembled as she forced herself to climb the stairs. She found Xavier standing in Nathaniel's doorway, his shirt spattered with blood, his eyes cold and empty. Behind him, she caught a glimpse of a still form on the floor and had to stifle a scream. Xavier's voice was calm, almost soothing as he guided her back downstairs. He spoke of accidents, of self-defense, of necessary evils. Mandy heard the words but couldn't process them. All she could think about was the sight of Nathaniel's lifeless body and the knowledge that, in a way, she was responsible for what had happened. As Xavier methodically began to clean up, to erase the evidence of what had transpired, Mandy sat in the kitchen, her mind reeling. The nightmare she had been living for months had just taken a turn she could never have imagined, and she knew with chilling certainty that her life would never be the same again. The hours that followed Nathaniel's death were a blur of frantic activity and cold calculation. Xavier, drawing on skills honed through years of criminal association, took charge of the situation with ruthless efficiency. Mandy, still in shock, found herself following Xavier's instructions mechanically. They cleaned the room meticulously, removing any trace of Xavier's presence. Nathaniel's body was wrapped in a tarp from the garage, then loaded into the trunk of Xavier's car under the cover of darkness. As dawn broke, Xavier drove away with grim purpose, leaving Mandy alone in the house with the impossible task of maintaining normalcy. When Ryan returned home later that morning, exhausted from his late night at the office, Mandy forced herself to greet him with a smile that felt like it might shatter her face. The day passed in a haze of mundane activities and internal panic. Mandy cooked, cleaned, and chatted with Ryan, all while her mind screamed with the knowledge of what had happened. When Ryan casually asked about Nathaniel's whereabouts, Mandy heard herself reply that he had mentioned going on a road trip with some friends. As days turned into weeks, the lie grew more elaborate. Mandy created a digital trail, sending emails from Nathaniel's account to Ryan, describing fictional adventures in various cities. She fielded concerned calls from Nathaniel's workplace, spinning tales of family emergencies and extended leaves of absence. Xavier had disposed of Nathaniel's body in an abandoned quarry several hours away, weighing it down to ensure it wouldn't be found. He meticulously eliminated any evidence that could connect them to Nathaniel's disappearance. For a while, it seemed their hastily constructed cover-up might hold. Life in Oakdale continued, with only a ripple of concern about Nathaniel's prolonged absence. But as winter gave way to spring, and Nathaniel's silence stretched on, questions began to multiply. Ryan's initial unconcern turned to worry, then to suspicion. Mandy found herself trapped in a web of lies that grew more complex and fragile with each passing day, knowing that it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. Detective Sandra Sloan had seen her fair share of missing persons cases in her 15 years with the Oakdale Police Department, but something about Nathaniel Robbie's disappearance nagged at her from the start. The pieces didn't quite fit. The sudden departure, the sporadic communication, the lack of financial activity. As spring bloomed in Oakdale, Detective Sloan dug deeper into the Robbie family dynamics. She interviewed friends, colleagues, and neighbors, slowly piecing together a picture of a household fraught with tension. The more she learned, the more her suspicions grew. Ryan Robbie, initially reluctant to involve the police, became an increasingly vocal advocate for finding his son. His faith in Mandy's explanations had begun to waver, and he pressed for a more thorough investigation. This pressure, combined with Detective Sloan's relentless pursuit of the truth, began to expose the cracks in Mandy's carefully constructed narrative. The breakthrough came in late April, when one of Nathaniel's co-workers at the garage came forward with crucial information. He recalled overhearing a heated argument between Nathaniel and Mandy just before Christmas, with mentions of money and threats. This revelation shifted the entire focus of the investigation. Detective Sloan brought Mandy in for questioning, subjecting her to hours of intense interrogation. Mandy, worn down by months of guilt and fear, began to falter. Her story, once seamless, now showed inconsistencies. She stumbled over dates, contradicted her earlier statements, and grew visibly agitated when pressed about her relationship with Nathaniel. As Mandy's composure crumbled, Detective Sloan sensed she was on the verge of a breakthrough. She decided to take a risk, bluffing about evidence they didn't actually have. She mentioned phone records showing frequent contact with an unknown number around the time of Nathaniel's disappearance, implying they knew about Xavier's involvement. The gambit worked. Mandy, believing the police knew far more than they actually did, broke down. Through tears and gasping sobs, she confessed to the affair, the blackmail, and her knowledge of Nathaniel's fate. She implicated Xavier, portraying herself as a terrified bystander to his actions. With Mandy's confession, the case broke wide open. An APB was issued for Xavier Krasinski, and search teams were dispatched to the quarry where Nathaniel's body had been hidden. As news of the confession spread through Oakdale, the community reeled from the shocking revelations. The picture-perfect family on Maple Street had harbored darker secrets than anyone could have imagined. In the days following Mandy's confession, Oakdale became the center of a media frenzy. News vans lined Maple Street, reporters clamoring for any tidbit of information about the scandalous murder that had rocked the quiet suburb. Detective Sloan, now heading a task force dedicated to the case, worked tirelessly to bring all the perpetrators to justice. Thanks to Detective Sloan's skillful coordination with state and federal authorities, Xavier was apprehended at a bus station in Nevada, attempting to cross into Mexico. His arrest was the final piece of the puzzle. Under intense interrogation, Xavier eventually corroborated much of Mandy's story, though he attempted to paint himself as a man driven to desperate measures by love. He revealed the location of key evidence, including the murder weapon and some of Nathaniel's personal effects, which he had kept as a twisted sort of trophy. As the full extent of the conspiracy came to light, the impact on those involved was profound. Ryan Robbie, confronted with the brutal truth of his wife's infidelity and his son's death, withdrew from public life. Friends reported that he seemed a shell of his former self, devastated by the twin betrayals of the two people he had trusted most. The community of Oakdale, once so proud of its safe, wholesome image, was forced to confront the darkness that had festered beneath the surface. For Detective Sloan, the resolution of the case was bittersweet. While she took pride in unraveling the complex web of lies and bringing the perpetrators to justice, she couldn't shake the feeling that if she had pieced things together sooner, the young man's life might have been saved. In the end, justice was served, but it brought little comfort to those most affected. Xavier, with his history of violence and his role as the primary actor in Nathaniel's death, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mandy, despite her attempts to paint herself as a victim of circumstance, was found guilty of conspiracy and accessory to murder. She received a 25-year sentence, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Ryan Robbie, a broken man, sold the family home and left Oakdale, unable to bear the constant reminders of his loss and betrayal. He retreated to a quiet life in another state, where he could grieve in private and attempt to rebuild some semblance of a life. The case left an indelible mark on Oakdale. The community, once known for its low crime rate and family-friendly atmosphere, now found itself grappling with a new, unwelcome notoriety. Saffron Callahan was a force to be reckoned with. From a young age, she exhibited a fierce determination and an insatiable curiosity that set her apart from her peers. Born to Liam and Fiona Callahan, Saffron's early years were marked by instability. Her father's struggle with alcoholism and her mother's subsequent depression created a tumultuous home environment. Despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, Saffron developed a resilience and drive that would shape her future. At school, Saffron excelled academically and socially. She was editor of the school newspaper, captain of the debate team, and a straight-A student. Her teachers often remarked on her ability to see through facades and uncover hidden truths, a skill that would later draw her to journalism. When her parents divorced during her sophomore year of college, Saffron found herself at a crossroads. Unwilling to choose between her parents and needing a stable environment to continue her studies, she accepted her Uncle Everett and Aunt Constance's offer to live with them. Moving into the Callahan family home was a turning point for Saffron. For the first time, she experienced the stability and support she had always craved. Everett, in particular, took an interest in nurturing her talents, often engaging her in discussions about politics, business, and current events. Everett Callahan was the epitome of the American dream. At 45, he had built a real estate empire from the ground up, transforming it into one of the most successful firms in the Northeast. His magnetic personality and sharp business acumen had earned him both admirers and enemies in equal measure. Standing tall with salt and pepper hair, Everett cut an imposing figure. He had a way of commanding any room he entered, his charm and wit drawing people in like moths to a flame. Everett's childhood had been markedly different from his current life of luxury. Growing up in a working-class family, he had learned the value of hard work and ambition from an early age. His father, a construction worker, and his mother, a waitress, had instilled in him a drive to succeed that bordered on obsession. After putting himself through college and business school, Everett had thrown himself into the world of real estate. His ability to spot potential where others saw only dilapidation had quickly set him apart from his peers. Within a decade, he had transformed the company from a small local firm into a regional powerhouse. To the outside world, Everett appeared to have it all: a beautiful wife, 2 children, a successful business, and a reputation as a pillar of the community. He served on the boards of several charities and was a generous donor to local causes. However, beneath this perfect exterior lurked a restlessness that Everett struggled to quell. Despite his outward success, Everett battled with a persistent feeling of emptiness. The thrill of closing deals and amassing wealth had begun to wane, leaving him searching for new sources of excitement. Everett's relationship with his niece Saffron
added another layer of complexity to his life. He saw in her a kindred spirit, someone who shared his drive and ambition. As she grew older, he found himself drawn to her in ways that both excited and disturbed him. The line between avuncular affection and something more sinister began to blur, setting the stage for the tragedy that was to come. It was a crisp autumn evening when Saffron's world turned upside down. She had been working late at the local newspaper, where she had secured an internship, when she realized she had left her laptop charger at home. Knowing her aunt and uncle were supposed to be at a charity gala that evening, she decided to swing by the house to retrieve it. As Saffron pulled into the driveway, she noticed her uncle's car parked in its usual spot. Thinking he must have decided to skip the gala, she entered the house quietly, not wanting to disturb him if he was working in his study. The house was eerily quiet as Saffron made her way upstairs. As she approached her room, she heard sounds coming from her uncle's bedroom. Concern and curiosity warred within her as she inched closer to the partially open door. What Saffron saw through the crack in the door would haunt her for the rest of her short life. There was her uncle Everett, locked in a passionate embrace with a woman who was decidedly not her Aunt Constance. Saffron's mind reeled as she tried to process what she was witnessing. The uncle she had idolized, the man she had seen as a paragon of virtue and success, was nothing but a common cheater. Backing away from the door, Saffron's foot caught on a loose floorboard, causing a loud creak. Her heart stopped as she heard the sudden silence from the bedroom. Without thinking, she dashed down the stairs and out of the house, barely remembering to close the front door behind her. Once in her car, Saffron sat trembling, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Shock, anger, and a strange sense of betrayal fought for dominance. She had always thought of her uncle as invincible, above the petty weaknesses of ordinary men. To see him engaged in such a tawdry affair shattered the pedestal she had placed him on. In the days that followed, Saffron found herself obsessively analyzing every interaction she had ever had with her uncle. She began to see hidden meanings in casual touches, to reinterpret compliments and gestures of affection through a new, unsettling lens. The knowledge of Everett's affair became a poisonous secret, eating away at Saffron from the inside. She found herself unable to meet her uncle's eyes at the dinner table, flinching away from his usual affectionate pat on the shoulder. Her aunt noticed the change in Saffron's behavior, but attributed it to stress from her internship and upcoming job search. Little did anyone know that this discovery would set in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. Veronica Ashworth was not the type of woman one would typically imagine as the other woman in an extramarital affair. At 38, she was a respected art curator at the Museum of Art in Hartford. Her professional demeanor and sophisticated taste made her a favorite among the city's elite, who often sought her advice on building their private collections. With her sharp features and penchant for minimalist designer clothing, Veronica cut a striking figure. She was intelligent, cultured, and fiercely independent, qualities that had initially drawn Everett to her. Their paths had first crossed at a museum fundraiser 2 years prior. Everett had been immediately captivated by Veronica's wit and her refreshingly direct manner. For her part, Veronica had found in Everett a man who could keep up with her intellectually, something she had found lacking in many of her previous relationships. What had begun as a meeting of minds soon evolved into a physical relationship. They would meet in upscale hotels during business trips, or steal moments together when Everett claimed to be working late. Veronica, who had sworn off serious relationships after a painful divorce in her early 30s, found herself falling for the charismatic real estate mogul. However, Veronica was not naive. She knew Everett was married and had no illusions about their relationship. She told herself that she was satisfied with the stolen moments and passionate encounters, that she didn't need or want the complications of a full-time relationship. Yet, as the affair continued, Veronica found herself increasingly dissatisfied with the secrecy and limitations of their arrangement. She began to hope, against her better judgment, that Everett might leave his wife for her. Little did Veronica know that her affair with Everett was about to be thrust into the spotlight in the most tragic way possible. The discovery of their relationship would set off a chain reaction that would end in murder, forever altering the lives of everyone involved. In the weeks following her discovery of Everett's affair, Saffron found herself spiraling into a dark obsession. Her once bright future seemed to dim as she became consumed with thoughts of her uncle and the mysterious other woman. Saffron's work at the newspaper began to suffer
as she spent countless hours scouring social media and local event photos, trying to identify the woman she had glimpsed in Everett's bedroom. Her search became all-consuming, causing her to neglect her responsibilities and withdraw from her friends and family. As she delved deeper into her investigation, Saffron began to experience a disturbing shift in her emotions. The initial shock and disgust at her uncle's infidelity gradually gave way to a complex mix of jealousy and desire. She found herself imagining what it would be like to be the object of Everett's illicit affections, to be the one he risked everything for. These thoughts both thrilled and horrified Saffron. She knew they were wrong, that the very idea of being attracted to her uncle was taboo. Yet she couldn't shake the growing fixation. She began to pay more attention to her appearance when she knew Everett would be around. Wearing more makeup and choosing outfits that accentuated her figure, Saffron's behavior didn't go unnoticed. Her Aunt Constance expressed concern over her niece's sudden mood swings and distracted demeanor. Everett, too, seemed to sense the change in Saffron, often catching her staring at him with an unreadable expression. One evening, as Saffron was helping Constance prepare dinner, she overheard a phone conversation between Everett and someone he called V. The intimate tone of his voice left no doubt in Saffron's mind that this was the other woman. Hearing the affection in her uncle's voice as he spoke to his lover ignited a fierce jealousy in Saffron that she could barely contain. That night, alone in her room, Saffron made a decision. She would expose Everett's affair, but not out of any sense of moral duty or concern for her aunt. Though Saffron's motivations were far more selfish and twisted, she convinced herself that by revealing the affair, she would be removing the other woman from the equation, leaving her free to pursue her own relationship with Everett. In her increasingly delusional state, Saffron began to reinterpret every interaction she'd ever had with her uncle. The proud smile he'd given her at her high school graduation, the long conversations they'd had about her future, the comforting hug he'd offered when she was upset. All of these took on new, inappropriate meanings in Saffron's mind. As she formulated her plan to confront Everett, Saffron's guilt and shame were overwhelmed by a toxic mix of desire and a misguided sense of entitlement. She had convinced herself that she understood Everett in a way no one else did, that they shared a special connection that transcended their familial relationship. Little did Saffron know that her descent into obsession was leading her down a path from which there would be no return. The once promising young journalist was now on a collision course with tragedy, driven by desires she barely understood, and a jealousy that would ultimately prove fatal. On a rainy Tuesday evening, Saffron decided it was time to put her plan into action. Saffron found Everett in his study, poring over some blueprints for a new development. She knocked on the open door, her heart pounding so loudly Everett looked up, his face breaking into a warm smile that made Saffron's knees weak. "Everett, is it all right if I talk to you about something?" Saffron's voice quavered slightly as she spoke. Noticing her serious tone, Everett's expression shifted to one of concern. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Saffron closed the door behind her and took a deep breath. "I know about your affair, Uncle Everett." The color drained from Everett's face as he stared at his niece in shock. "I saw you that night you were supposed to be at the gala. I came home and saw you with her." She paused, gathering her courage for what she was about to say next. "And I want you to know that it's okay. I understand." Everett's shock turned to confusion. "This isn't something you should be involved in. It's complicated, and it's not what you think." Taking a step closer to her uncle, Saffron's voice dropped to a near whisper. "I think it's exactly what I think. You're not happy with Aunt Constance. You need someone who truly understands you, someone who can match your passion and ambition." With each word, she moved closer until she was standing directly in front of Everett's desk. Everett stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Saffron, this conversation needs to end right now. You're my niece, and what you're implying is completely inappropriate." But Saffron was too far gone in her delusion to heed the warning in Everett's voice. In a move that would forever alter the course of both their lives, she circled the desk and pressed herself against him. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Everett looked down at his niece, a mix of emotions playing across his face: shock, anger, and something darker that Saffron mistook for desire. Then, with a forceful push, he shoved her away from him. "What do you think you're doing? Have you lost your mind?" The rejection hit Saffron like a physical blow. She stumbled backwards, her face flushing with humiliation and anger. Neither of them could have known in that moment how this confrontation would set in motion a series of events that would end in tragedy. The lines had been crossed and there was no going back. In the days following the confrontation, an uneasy tension settled over the Callahan household. Saffron avoided Everett as much as possible, shame and anger warring within her. Everett, for his part, seemed determined to pretend nothing had happened, maintaining a facade of normalcy that only heightened Saffron's distress. It was on a Friday evening, nearly 2 weeks after the incident in the study, that everything changed. Constance had taken the children to visit her parents for the weekend, leaving Everett and Saffron alone in the house. Saffron had been planning to spend the evening out with friends, a desperate attempt to escape the suffocating atmosphere at home. As she was heading out the door, Everett called out to her, "Saffron, can we talk for a moment?" Everett gestured for her to join him in the living room. "I think we need to clear the air about what happened." Saffron sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, her body tense. "I'd rather not talk about it. Can we just forget it ever happened?" Everett sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't think we can." Something in his tone made Saffron look up, meeting his eyes for the first time in weeks. What she saw there made her breath catch in her throat. Gone was the anger and disgust she had expected. Instead, she saw a mixture of guilt, desire, and resignation that mirrored her own conflicted emotions. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. Everett moved closer, his voice low and intense. "This is wrong, Saffron. We both know it's wrong. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about you." What followed was a passionate, frenzied encounter that left them both breathless and filled with equal parts exhilaration and shame. As they lay tangled together on the sofa, the full weight of what they had done began to settle over them. In the weeks that followed, Everett and Saffron engaged in a dangerous dance of stolen moments and secret rendezvous. They both knew what they were doing was wrong, that it could destroy their family if anyone ever found out. But the thrill of their forbidden relationship, combined with the genuine affection and understanding they shared, proved too addictive to give up. Little did they know that their illicit affair was building towards a catastrophic conclusion. The web of lies and betrayal they were weaving would soon unravel with deadly consequences. As Everett and Saffron's secret relationship intensified, the atmosphere in the Callahan home grew increasingly strained. Constance, though unaware of the true nature of the situation, sensed that something was amiss. She noticed the furtive glances between her husband and niece, the way they seemed to tense up when in the same room together. The situation came to a head one Saturday afternoon when Constance walked in on Everett and Saffron in what appeared to be an intense, whispered argument. They sprang apart as soon as they noticed her, but Constance had seen enough to arouse her suspicions. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice laced with concern and a hint of accusation. Saffron mumbled something about a disagreement over a business proposal before hurrying from the room. Everett attempted to smooth things over, claiming he had been giving Saffron advice about her career prospects, but Constance remained unconvinced. From that moment on, Constance began to pay closer attention to her husband and niece's interactions. She noticed how they always seemed to be in the same room, how their conversations would abruptly cease when she entered. A seed of doubt had been planted, and it was beginning to grow. As the weeks passed, the tension in the house became palpable. Family dinners, once a time of lively conversation and laughter, became stilted affairs filled with awkward silences and forced small talk. Constance's attempts to draw out what was wrong were met with deflection from Everett and evasion from Saffron. Unbeknownst to all, the carefully constructed facade of the Callahan family was beginning to crack. The truth, with all its ugly implications, was threatening to burst forth, and when it did, the consequences would be devastating. As autumn gave way to winter, Everett Callahan found himself trapped in a prison of his own making. The initial thrill of his affair with Saffron had long since faded, replaced by a constant, gnawing anxiety. The pressure was coming from all sides. Veronica, unaware of his dalliance with Saffron, had begun to push for more commitment. She wanted him to leave Constance, to start a new life with her. Her patience was wearing thin, and her threats to expose their affair were becoming more frequent and more serious. At home, Constance's suspicions had not abated. Her once trusting nature had been replaced by a quiet watchfulness that set Everett's nerves on edge. He caught her checking his phone when she thought he wasn't looking, noticed her questioning glances when he came home late from work. But it was Saffron who posed the greatest threat. What had begun as a misguided infatuation on her part had evolved into something far more dangerous. She had become possessive, jealous not just of Constance but of Veronica as well. Her demands for Everett's time and attention were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. One particularly tense evening,
After a close call where Constance had nearly walked in on them in a compromising position, Everett tried to end things with Saffron. "This has to stop," he had told her. Saffron's eyes had flashed with a mixture of hurt and anger. "You can't end this, I won't let you. If you try to leave me, I'll tell everyone what we've done." The threat hung in the air between them, and Everett felt the last vestiges of control slipping away from him. He was trapped, caught between three women, each holding a piece of his destruction in their hands. The night that would change everything started like any other. The Callahan family had just finished dinner, with Constance and the children settling in for a movie night. Everett begged off, claiming he had work to finish in his study. Saffron too excused herself, saying she had plans with friends. But Saffron had no intention of going out that night. Instead, she waited until she was sure the rest of the family was engrossed in their movie before slipping into Everett's study. She found him at his desk, his head in his hands. "We need to talk," Saffron said, closing the door behind her. Saffron moved closer, her eyes blazing with a mixture of hurt and determination. "You need to choose her or me. I won't be your little secret anymore." In that moment, looking at Saffron's face twisted with jealousy and desperation, Everett saw his entire life crumbling before his eyes. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was about to be torn apart by this girl's misguided obsession. Something inside Everett broke. With a roar of frustration and fear, he lunged at Saffron, his hands closing around her throat. He wanted to stop her, to silence the threats that were destroying his world. But once he started, he couldn't stop. Saffron's eyes widened in shock and fear as she clawed at his hands, trying to break free. But Everett was stronger, his grip fueled by panic and adrenaline. It was over in minutes. Saffron's struggles weakened, then ceased altogether. When Everett finally came to his senses and released his grip, she crumpled to the floor, lifeless. The discovery of Saffron's body sent shockwaves through the Callahan household and the wider community. It was Constance who found her, alerted by the unusual silence from Everett's study. Her scream of horror brought the children running, and within minutes the house was swarming with police and paramedics. Everett, in a state of shock, had been found sitting in his chair staring blankly at Saffron's body. He offered no resistance as the police led him away, his silence interpreted as stunned grief by the officers on the scene. Detective Lena Kirka, a veteran of the police department's homicide division, was assigned to lead the investigation. From the moment she stepped into the Callahan home, she sensed that this case was far more complex than a simple home invasion gone wrong, which was the initial theory. As she interviewed the family members, inconsistencies began to emerge. Constance, while devastated, seemed to be harboring suspicions about her husband. The children, Rowan and Ivy, spoke of increasing tension in the house over the past few months, particularly between Everett and Saffron. But it was Everett's behavior that raised the most red flags for Detective Kirk. His affect was flat, his responses to questions vague and evasive. He claimed to have been working in his study all evening, not hearing anything until Constance's scream. Yet, the detective noted there were signs of a struggle in the room, and Everett's clothing was disheveled. As the investigation progressed, more questions arose. Why had Saffron lied about going out with friends? What was she doing in Everett's study so late at night? And most intriguingly, who was the mysterious V that appeared frequently in Saffron's text messages and emails? The autopsy report brought another twist to the case. The cause of death was strangulation, but the medical examiner also found evidence of sexual activity shortly before Saffron's death. This revelation cast the case in a new, disturbing light. As Detective Kirk dug deeper, she began to uncover a web of secrets and lies that ran through the heart of the Callahan family. The picture-perfect facade was crumbling, revealing dark truths that would shock the community to its core. As the investigation into Saffron's murder intensified, Detective Kirk and her team began to piece together the complex puzzle of relationships and secrets within the Callahan family. Each new revelation brought them closer to the shocking truth. A breakthrough came when forensics recovered deleted text messages from Saffron's phone. The messages revealed a passionate, illicit relationship with an older man, referred to only as E. The content of the messages left little doubt that E was Everett Callahan. Armed with this information, Detective Kirk brought Everett in for another round of questioning. Faced with the evidence, Everett's carefully constructed alibi began to crumble. He admitted to the affair with Saffron, but vehemently denied killing her, claiming that their relationship had been consensual and that he loved his niece. However, Everett's story was further complicated when Veronica Ashworth came forward. Initially reluctant to involve herself in the investigation, Veronica finally revealed her long-standing affair with Everett after being confronted with evidence linking her to him. Her testimony painted a picture of a man torn between multiple relationships, struggling to keep his various secrets from colliding. Meanwhile, a more thorough search of the Callahan home uncovered a journal hidden in Saffron's room. The entries detailed her growing obsession with her uncle, her discovery of his affair with Veronica, and her plan to confront him on the night of her death. The final entry, dated the day she died, contained a chilling line. "Tonight everything changes. He'll have to choose, her or me." This evidence, combined with the forensic analysis of the crime scene, began to paint a clear picture of what had transpired on that fatal night. DNA evidence found under Saffron's fingernails matched Everett's, indicating a struggle. Fibers from Everett's clothing were found on Saffron's body, contradicting his initial statement that he hadn't been in close contact with her that evening. As the case against Everett built, other witnesses came forward. A neighbor reported hearing raised voices coming from the Callahan house on the night of the murder. A colleague of Everett's mentioned his increasingly erratic behavior at work in the weeks leading up to Saffron's death. Perhaps the most damning testimony came from Constance. After days of questioning and faced with the mounting evidence of her husband's infidelity, she finally broke down. She revealed that she had suspected something was going on between Everett and Saffron for weeks. On the night of the murder, she had overheard part of their argument, but had been too afraid to intervene. As Detective Kirk compiled all the evidence, a timeline of events emerged. Saffron had confronted Everett about his affair with Veronica, threatening to expose both relationships if he didn't choose her. In a moment of panic and rage, Everett had strangled Saffron, then attempted to cover up his crime. The case, which had once seemed like a tragic home invasion, had unraveled into a sordid tale of forbidden desire, jealousy, and ultimately, murder. The respected Callahan family, once the picture of suburban success, now stood exposed as a web of lies and betrayal. The courtroom was packed each day as the prosecution laid out its case, painting a picture of a man whose web of lies and illicit relationships had finally caught up with him. Prosecutor presented a compelling narrative, weaving together the physical evidence, witness testimonies, and the damning contents of Saffron's journal. She portrayed Everett as a manipulative predator who had taken advantage of his young, vulnerable niece, then killed her in a fit of rage when she threatened to expose him. Everett's defense team attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. They argued that the physical evidence was circumstantial and that Saffron's journal entries were the fantasies of a troubled young woman. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Everett himself took the stand. Under intense cross-examination, he finally admitted to his affair with Saffron, but continued to deny killing her. His emotional breakdown on the stand, as he begged for forgiveness from his family, left many in the courtroom stunned. As the trial neared its conclusion, both the prosecution and defense made impassioned final arguments. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. In a moment of high drama, the foreman stood and declared Everett Callahan guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced Everett to 25 years to life in prison, bringing a close to a case that had shocked and captivated the nation. The Callahan tragedy left an indelible mark on the community. The family's once pristine reputation was in tatters, their name forever associated with scandal and murder. Emmett Dalton grew up the youngest of 3 siblings. His family owned a small hardware store, which had been in the Dalton family for generations. Emmett was always known as the gentle soul of the family, with a kind word for everyone and a willingness to help anyone in need. He had a close relationship with his parents, who cherished his thoughtful and considerate nature. In school, Emmett was not the most popular kid, but he was well-liked for his easygoing attitude and warm smile. He had a small circle of friends who appreciated his loyalty and sense of humor.
After graduating high school, Emmett decided to stay in their home to help his parents run the hardware store. He enjoyed the simple life and found contentment in the routine of small-town living. Emmett's relationship with his family was solid. His older siblings had moved to nearby cities but frequently visited, maintaining a strong bond with their youngest brother. Emmett was particularly close to his sister Rachel, who often confided in him and sought his advice. His parents, though traditional in their ways, were supportive of Emmett and proud of the man he had become. Emmett had a few relationships, none of which were particularly serious. He was looking for someone who shared his values and appreciated the quiet life he enjoyed. Lila Renshaw was a strikingly beautiful woman with an air of mystery that captivated those around her. She grew up in the bustling city of Larkspur, a stark contrast to the quiet town. Lila's upbringing was far from idyllic. Her parents had a hard relationship, marked by frequent arguments and bouts of separation. As an only child, Lila often found herself caught in the middle of their conflicts, learning early on how to manipulate situations to her advantage. In her teenage years, Lila developed a reputation for being headstrong and manipulative. She had a string of relationships, each ending in turmoil due to her controlling nature. Lila thrived on power and control, often pushing her partners to the brink with her demanding and possessive behavior. Despite this, her charm and allure made it difficult for people to see her true nature until it was too late. After finishing high school, Lila moved to town in search of a fresh start. She quickly found a job at a local boutique, where her charisma and sales skills made her a favorite among customers. It was here that she met Emmett Dalton, a regular customer who was immediately taken by her beauty and confidence. To Lila, Emmett seemed like the perfect target, a kind, gentle man who was easy to control. Lila's past relationships had always followed a similar pattern. She would charm her way into her partner's life, gradually isolating them from their friends and family. Once she had established control, her true colors would show, leading to intense arguments and emotional manipulation. Her partners often felt trapped, unable to leave due to Lila's relentless grip on their lives. When Lila met Emmett, she saw him as another challenge, someone she could mold and control. She was drawn to his kindness and vulnerability, seeing them as weaknesses she could exploit. Emmett's trusting nature made it easy for Lila to weave her way into his life, slowly isolating him from those who cared about him. To the outside world, Lila and Emmett appeared to be a happy couple, but behind closed doors a much darker story was unfolding. Emmett first met Lila on a warm summer afternoon at the local boutique. He was shopping for a birthday gift for his mother when Lila, with her striking looks and confident demeanor, offered to help him. Their interaction was brief, but left a lasting impression on Emmett. He couldn't stop thinking about her radiant smile and the way she seemed genuinely interested in helping him. A few days later, Emmett returned to the boutique, this time with the intention of asking Lila out. To his delight, she accepted, and they arranged to meet for coffee at a quaint cafe in town. Their first date was filled with laughter and easy conversation. Lila was charming and attentive, asking Emmett about his life, his family, and his dreams. Emmett felt an immediate connection, believing he had finally found someone who truly understood him. As their relationship progressed, Emmett's friends and family noticed how happy he seemed. Lila often joined him at family gatherings and social events, quickly becoming a familiar face in the community. She seemed to fit right in, and Emmett's parents were pleased to see their son so content. However, there were subtle changes in Emmett that only those closest to him noticed. Lila's charm had a way of overshadowing her more manipulative tendencies. She began to subtly influence Emmett's decisions, steering him away from activities and people she deemed unnecessary. At first, it was small things, like suggesting they spend more time alone together or questioning the motives of his friends. Emmett, eager to please Lila and maintain the harmony of their relationship, often acquiesced to her demands. Lila was meticulous in her approach. She never directly forbade Emmett from seeing his friends or family, but she planted seeds of doubt in his mind. She would mention how certain friends didn't seem to appreciate him, or how his family was overly critical. Emmett, who had always been sensitive to others' opinions, began to internalize these suggestions, gradually distancing himself from his loved ones. Despite these changes, Emmett remained convinced that Lila was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He admired her confidence and believed that she had his best interests at heart. Lila, on the other hand, was pleased with how easily she had managed to isolate Emmett. She felt a sense of power knowing that she was the center of his world, controlling his actions and decisions. Their relationship continued to deepen, with Emmett becoming more dependent on Lila for emotional support and validation. Lila, aware of her influence, began to tighten her grip, ensuring that Emmett had little to no contact with anyone outside their relationship. To the outside world, they appeared to be a perfect couple, but behind closed doors, the dynamics were far more sinister. Emmett's once vibrant social life dwindled to nothing, leaving him isolated and completely under Lila's control. As the months passed, Lila's control over Emmett grew stronger. She employed subtle yet effective methods to isolate him from his family and friends, ensuring that he remained entirely dependent on her. It started with casual suggestions and offhand comments, but gradually, her tactics became more manipulative and deliberate. One evening, as Emmett prepared to meet his sister Rachel for dinner, Lila expressed concern about his family's influence on him. She mentioned how they always seemed to criticize their relationship and hinted that perhaps they didn't truly want him to be happy. Emmett, already sensitive to his family's opinions, began to doubt their intentions. He canceled the dinner, opting instead to stay home with Lila. Lila also made it a point to be present whenever Emmett received phone calls from friends or family. She would sit close by, making him uncomfortable and self-conscious about the conversation. Over time, Emmett's calls to his loved ones became less frequent as he grew tired of the tension it caused. His friends noticed his absence from social gatherings and reached out, but Lila always found a way to intercept their messages or make excuses for why Emmett couldn't attend. Lila's control extended to Emmett's daily routines and activities. She insisted on accompanying him everywhere, from grocery shopping to his volunteer work at the local community center. Emmett, eager to keep the peace, didn't resist. He began to feel suffocated, but he couldn't pinpoint the source of his discomfort. Lila's constant presence and influence made it difficult for him to think clearly or make decisions independently. One particularly telling incident occurred when Emmett's childhood friend, Leo, invited him on a weekend fishing trip. Emmett, excited about the prospect of reconnecting with Leo, shared the news with Lila. Her reaction was swift and intense. She questioned Leo's motives, suggesting that he was trying to pull Emmett away from their relationship. Lila accused Emmett of being inconsiderate, claiming that he was abandoning her for a frivolous outing. Emmett, caught off guard by her emotional outburst, reluctantly declined Leo's invitation. Lila's manipulation didn't stop there. She began to control Emmett's finances, convincing him to merge their bank accounts for convenience. This move further isolated Emmett, as he now had limited access to his own money. Lila monitored his spending closely, questioning every purchase and often overriding his decisions. Emmett felt increasingly powerless, unable to assert himself without facing Lila's wrath. Despite these red flags, Emmett continued to believe that Lila had his best interests at heart. He rationalized her behavior as a sign of her deep love and commitment to their relationship. However, the isolation took a toll on his mental and emotional well-being. He became withdrawn and anxious, struggling to reconcile his love for Lila with the growing sense of entrapment. Lila, sensing Emmett's inner turmoil, doubled down on her efforts to isolate him. She discouraged him from seeking help or confiding in others, framing it as a betrayal of their trust. Emmett, already emotionally fragile, complied. He cut off contact with the few remaining friends and family members he had left, fully entrusting his life to Lila's control. As the months turned into a year, Emmett's world became smaller and more confined. His once vibrant and fulfilling life was reduced to the narrow confines of his relationship with Lila. The community, unaware of the turmoil behind closed doors, continued to see them as a happy couple. Despite Lila's control, there were moments when he longed for the comfort and support of his family and friends. These flickers of desire for connection were met with resistance from Lila, who sensed that she was losing her grip on him. One afternoon, Emmett found himself standing outside the hardware store, reminiscing about the days when he would work alongside his father. He missed the camaraderie of the small community and the simple joys of his previous life. On an impulse, he decided to visit his parents, hoping for a moment of normalcy and perhaps a chance to explain his absence. When Emmett arrived at his parents' house, they were overjoyed to see him. His mother, Eleanor, embraced him tightly, her eyes filled with concern. His father, Thomas, greeted him with a firm handshake, his expression a mix of relief and worry. Emmett felt a surge of emotion as he sat down with his parents, who eagerly caught him up on family news and events. For a brief moment, Emmett felt like himself again, surrounded by the warmth and familiarity of his family. However, as the visit progressed, he could sense Lila's disapproval hanging over him like a dark cloud. She had called him multiple times during the visit, each call more insistent than the last. Emmett's parents noticed his unease and gently probed, asking if everything was all right. Emmett hesitated, but eventually confided in his parents about the strain he was feeling. He didn't go into detail about Lila's manipulative behavior, but he mentioned feeling overwhelmed and isolated. Eleanor and Thomas listened attentively, offering their support and urging Emmett to reach out more often. They assured him that he was always welcome and that they would help him in any way they could. Leaving his parents' house that day, Emmett felt a glimmer of hope. He resolved to reconnect with his family and friends, believing that their support would help him regain a sense of normalcy. However, when he returned home, Lila was waiting for him, her eyes cold and calculating. Lila's anger was palpable. She accused Emmett of betraying her trust and undermining their relationship. She framed his visit to his parents as a deliberate attempt to distance himself from her. Emmett, caught off guard by her intensity, tried to explain that he simply missed his family and needed their support. But Lila wouldn't hear of it. She berated him, using emotional manipulation to make him feel guilty and ashamed. The following days were a nightmare for Emmett. Lila's controlling behavior escalated, and she became more possessive and paranoid. She monitored his every move, checking his phone and questioning his whereabouts. Emmett felt trapped, unable to breathe under the suffocating weight of her control. Despite Lila's efforts, Emmett managed to reach out to his sister Rachel through discreet messages. Rachel, sensing her brother's distress, agreed to meet him in secret. They met at a secluded park, where Emmett poured out his heart, revealing the extent of Lila's manipulation and control. Rachel was horrified and immediately offered her support, vowing to help Emmett break free from Lila's grasp. Emmett's attempts to reconnect with his loved ones were fraught with challenges. Lila's influence was pervasive, and she used every tool at her disposal to maintain her control over him. However, the seeds of doubt had been planted in Emmett's mind. He began to see through Lila's facade, recognizing her manipulative tactics for what they were. The more he tried to reconnect with his family and friends, the more determined he became to regain his independence and escape from Lila's clutches. The tension between Emmett and Lila reached a boiling point one fateful evening. Emmett had been secretly meeting with his sister Rachel, seeking her support and advice on how to extricate himself from Lila's control. Rachel, deeply concerned for her brother's well-being, urged him to leave Lila and return to his family. Emmett, emboldened by his sister's encouragement, decided it was time to confront Lila and end their toxic relationship. Emmett chose a quiet Sunday afternoon to break the news to Lila. He hoped that the calmness of the day would help keep the situation from escalating. As they sat in their living room, Emmett took a deep breath and told Lila that he needed some space and time apart. He explained that he felt suffocated and isolated, and that he needed to reconnect with his family and friends to find himself again. Lila's reaction was immediate and explosive. She accused Emmett of being ungrateful and selfish, of abandoning the relationship they had built together. Her voice rose in anger, and she began to hurl insults and accusations, attempting to undermine Emmett's resolve. She claimed that his family and friends didn't truly care about him, that they only wanted to control him and pull him away from her. Emmett tried to remain calm, but Lila's relentless tirade wore him down. He felt a mix of anger, guilt, and sadness as he listened to her venomous words. Despite her emotional manipulation, Emmett knew that he couldn't continue living under her control. He stood his ground, repeating his need for space and asserting that he was making the decision for his own well-being. Lila, realizing that her usual tactics were not working, shifted her approach. She broke down in tears, pleading with Emmett to reconsider. She promised to change, to give him more freedom, and to be more understanding. Emmett, seeing through her manipulative behavior, remained firm in his decision. He told her that he needed to leave, and that it was the best thing for both of them. The atmosphere in the room grew tense and charged with emotion. Lila's tears quickly turned to anger again, and she lashed out, accusing Emmett of cheating and betrayal. Emmett, exhausted and emotionally drained, decided to leave the house for a while to clear his head. He grabbed his jacket and walked out the door, leaving Lila seething with rage. When Emmett finally returned home, he found Lila waiting for him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She approached him with a calm demeanor, apologizing for her outburst and begging for another chance. Emmett, though sympathetic to her pain, stood his ground and reiterated his need for space. That night, as Emmett tried to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Lila's behavior had become increasingly erratic, and he feared that her desperation might drive her to do something drastic. His instincts were correct. In the early hours of the morning, Emmett was awakened by a noise in the living room. He got up to investigate and found Lila sitting on the couch, clutching a large kitchen knife. Her eyes were wild with desperation and anger. Emmett's heart raced as he tried to talk her down, but Lila's mind was made up. She accused Emmett of ruining her life, of turning everyone against her. In a fit of rage, she lunged at him with the knife. Emmett managed to dodge her initial attack, but Lila was relentless. A struggle ensued, with Emmett trying to disarm Lila while avoiding her frantic swings. In the chaos, Lila's grip on the knife slipped, and Emmett seized the opportunity to wrest it from her hand. In the aftermath of the struggle, both were left breathless and shaken. Emmett, now holding the knife, dropped it and stepped back, giving Lila space to calm down. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Emmett knew he had to leave. He quickly packed a bag and, without looking back, walked out of the house, leaving Lila behind. He drove to his parents' home, where he was welcomed with open arms, as he told them everything that just happened. Emmett knew that the road to recovery would be long and difficult, but he was ready to take the first step. Lila, consumed by a mix of rage and despair, couldn't accept the loss of control over Emmett. Her mind raced with thoughts of revenge and retribution. She felt humiliated and abandoned, and her desperation turned into a dangerous resolve. In the days following Emmett's departure, Lila's behavior became increasingly insane. She spent hours pacing the house, plotting ways to regain control over Emmett. Her anger festered, and she began to see his decision to leave as an unforgivable betrayal. Lila convinced herself that Emmett's family and friends were to blame for his decision, and she resolved to make him pay for abandoning her. One evening, as Emmett was visiting his parents, Lila devised a plan. She knew that Emmett often took a walk through a secluded part of town in the evenings to clear his head. She decided to confront him there, away from prying eyes. Armed with the same kitchen knife from their previous altercation, Lila set out to intercept Emmett. As Emmett approached a secluded park, he was startled to see Lila standing there, her eyes fixed on him. He stopped in his tracks, a mix of fear and sadness washing over him. Lila's appearance was disheveled, and her eyes burned with a dangerous intensity. Emmett knew that this confrontation could not end well. Lila's voice was cold and menacing, as she accused Emmett of ruining her life. She blamed him for her misery and demanded that he return to her. Emmett tried to reason with her, explaining that their relationship was toxic and that he needed to move on for his own well-being. But Lila was beyond reason. In a sudden, violent outburst, Lila lunged at Emmett with the knife. Emmett tried to defend himself, but Lila's rage gave her a frightening strength. A struggle ensued, with Emmett desperately trying to disarm her. In the chaos, Lila managed to stab Emmett, the blade piercing his side. Emmett cried out in pain, but Lila showed no signs of stopping. As Emmett fell to the ground, clutching his wound, Lila stood over him, her face contorted with fury and madness. Emmett, weakened and bleeding, pleaded with her to stop, but his words fell on deaf ears. Lila, consumed by her desire for control and revenge, delivered a final fatal blow. The once peaceful park was now a crime scene, with Emmett lying lifeless on the ground. Lila, covered in his blood, stood there for a moment, her mind slowly registering the reality of what she had done. Realizing that she couldn't stay there, Lila fled the scene, leaving Emmett's body behind. She drove aimlessly through the night, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. She knew that it was only a matter of time before the police would come looking for her. The next morning, Emmett's body was discovered by a passerby who immediately called the police. The murder of Emmett Dalton sent shockwaves through the community, a town unaccustomed to such violence. The local police, led by Detective Samuel Carter, launched a thorough investigation to uncover the truth behind Emmett's tragic death. As the news spread, the tight-knit community rallied around Emmett's family, offering support and demanding justice. Detective Carter, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving complex cases, began his work by examining the crime scene. The secluded park where Emmett's body was found offered little in the way of witnesses, but the brutality of the attack indicated a crime of passion. The wounds on Emmett's body suggested a frenzied assault, pointing to someone who knew him well. The investigation quickly focused on Lila Renshaw, Emmett's estranged girlfriend. Neighbors and acquaintances described their tumultuous relationship, with several recounting instances of Lila's controlling behavior. Emmett's family provided crucial insights into the couple's recent conflicts and Emmett's attempts to distance himself from Lila. These testimonies painted a picture of a relationship marked by manipulation, culminating in a fatal confrontation. Detective Carter and his team conducted a thorough search of Lila's home, uncovering several pieces of incriminating evidence. They found Emmett's blood on Lila's clothing and the kitchen knife used in the attack hidden in a drawer. Lila's phone records showed multiple calls to Emmett on the night of the murder, further implicating her in the crime. As the evidence mounted, the police issued an arrest warrant for Lila. She was located in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, attempting to evade capture. When the police arrived, Lila offered little resistance, her demeanor one of resignation. The trial was a highly publicized event, drawing attention from the local community. Emmett's family attended every session, their presence a poignant reminder of the loss they had suffered. The prosecution presented a compelling case, detailing Lila's manipulative behavior and the violent nature of the crime. Witnesses testified about Lila's possessiveness and her efforts to isolate Emmett from his loved ones. Lila's defense team attempted to portray her as a victim of circumstance, arguing that she had acted in a moment of emotional turmoil. However, the overwhelming evidence, coupled with Lila's lack of remorse, left little room for doubt. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a guilty verdict. Lila was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Her conviction brought a sense of closure to Emmett's family, though the pain of their loss would never fully heal. The community mourned the senseless death of one of its own, grappling with the realization that such darkness could exist in their midst. The story of Emmett Dalton and Lila Renshaw became a lasting reminder of the importance of recognizing and addressing the signs of abuse. It highlighted the need for community support and the power of collective action in creating a safer world for everyone. At the center of this stood the Blackwood residence, a home that seemed to embody the American dream. From the outside, the Blackwoods appeared to be the very image of a perfect blended family. Terrence Blackwood, a distinguished man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair, had built a small empire in real estate development. His wife of 3 years, Lorelei, was a former model whose grace and charm had seemingly not faded with age. Ivy, Terrence's biological daughter from his first marriage, was a bright and ambitious college student, while Callum, Lorelei's son from her previous marriage, had recently graduated and was on the cusp of starting his own career. To their neighbors and friends, the Blackwoods represented success, unity, and the possibility of second chances. Terrence and Lorelei's whirlwind romance and subsequent marriage had been the talk of Maple Grove, a beacon of hope for those who believed in love after loss. The integration of their children into a cohesive family unit seemed effortless, a testament to their parenting and the adaptability of youth. Yet beneath this carefully cultivated image of familial bliss, currents of tension and secrets ran deep. The walls of their house held whispers of unspoken truths, forbidden desires, and simmering resentments. Terrence Blackwood's journey to the pinnacle of suburban success was paved with both triumph and tragedy. Born to working-class parents in Pittsburgh, he had clawed his way up the socio-economic ladder through sheer determination and an uncanny ability to spot lucrative real estate opportunities. By his mid-30s, Terrence had established a company that would eventually reshape the skyline of several mid-sized Pennsylvania cities. His first marriage to Elizabeth, a college sweetheart, had been a partnership of equals. Together, they navigated the challenges of building a business while raising their daughter, Ivy. Elizabeth's sudden death from an aneurysm when Ivy was just 12 had left Terrence a widower, forcing him to balance his grief with the responsibilities of single parenthood and an expanding enterprise. For 5 years, Terrence poured himself into work and fatherhood, his romantic life relegated to the back burner. It wasn't until a chance encounter at a charity gala that he met Lorelei Vaughn, a woman whose allure would reignite his passion for life and love. Lorelei's path had been markedly different from Terrence's. Discovered by a modeling scout at 16, she had graced runways and magazine covers throughout her 20s. Her marriage to photographer Julian Reeves had produced a son, Callum, but the union crumbled under the weight of Julian's infidelities and Lorelei's fading modeling career. Divorced at 35, Lorelei found herself navigating single motherhood and a world that seemed to value youth above all else. When Terrence and Lorelei's worlds collided, it was as if the universe had decided to grant them both a second chance at happiness. Their courtship was swift and intense, culminating in a lavish wedding that was the social event of the year in Maple Grove. The newly formed Blackwood family moved into the house, ready to begin their life together. Ivy Blackwood, now 20 and studying psychology at a prestigious university, had initially struggled with her father's remarriage. Fiercely intelligent and deeply loyal to her late mother's memory, Ivy approached her new family dynamic with a mixture of skepticism and reluctant acceptance. Over time, however, she found herself warming to Lorelei's genuine attempts at connection and the novel experience of having a brother figure in her life. Callum Reeves, 22 and freshly graduated with a degree in business, viewed his mother's marriage to Terrence with a pragmatic eye. He appreciated the stability and opportunities that came with being part of the Blackwood family, even as he harbored ambitions of forging his own path in the business world. Charming and adaptable, Callum seemed to ease into his role as stepson and brother with natural grace. As the family settled into their new dynamic, outsiders marveled at how seamlessly they had blended. Terrence and Lorelei were seen as pillars of the community, hosting charity events and involving themselves in local politics. Ivy and Callum's academic achievements were points of pride, held up as examples of the family's success. Yet behind closed doors, the careful balance of the Blackwood household teetered on a precarious edge. Unspoken desires, hidden resentments, and the weight of expectations created an atmosphere ripe for upheaval. As the summer heat intensified, so too did the tensions, building towards a crescendo that would shatter the illusion of their perfect life. July 15, 2023, dawned bright and oppressively humid in Maple Grove. The Blackwood household stirred to life with its usual morning rhythms, unaware that by nightfall, their lives would be irrevocably altered. Terrence rose early, his mind already racing with the day's agenda. A crucial meeting with investors was scheduled for the afternoon, potentially opening doors for Blackwood Development's most ambitious project yet. As he knotted his tie with practiced precision, Lorelei entered their ensuite bathroom, her silk robe whispering against her skin. "Morning, darling," Lorelei murmured, pressing a kiss to Terrence's cheek. "Any plans for dinner tonight? I was thinking we could try that new Italian place in town." Terrence's reflection frowned slightly in the mirror. "I'm not sure when I'll be back," he replied. "This meeting could run late. Don't wait up for me." Lorelei's smile faltered for a moment before she recovered, years of modeling having trained her to maintain a pleasant facade. "Of course," she said lightly. "Another time, then." Downstairs, Ivy hunched over a bowl of cereal, her eyes glued to her phone as she scrolled through social media. She barely glanced up as her father entered the kitchen, grunting a perfunctory good morning. Callum, ever the early riser, had already left for his internship at a local marketing firm. His absence was noted by Terrence, who had been hoping to discuss some potential business connections that could benefit his stepson's budding career. As Terrence gathered his briefcase and car keys, he paused to kiss Lorelei goodbye. With that, he was gone, the sound of his car engine fading as he drove away. The day progressed without incident. Ivy left for her summer job at the local library, while Lorelei busied herself with household tasks and preparations for an upcoming charity event. The house settled into a quiet lull, the calm before an impending storm. It was just past 3 p.m. when Terrence's car unexpectedly pulled into the driveway. His meeting had concluded early, a rare occurrence that left him with mixed feelings of triumph and unease. The deal had been secured faster than anticipated, leaving him with an unfamiliar stretch of free time. As he entered the house, the silence struck him as odd. Lorelei's car was gone, likely out running errands. Terrence loosened his tie, deciding to use this unexpected free time to relax before sharing the good news with his family. His footsteps echoed through the empty hallway as he climbed the stairs, intent on changing into more comfortable clothes. As he approached the upper landing, a muffled sound caught his attention. It came from Ivy's room, a mix of whispers and what sounded unsettlingly like stifled laughter. Concern and curiosity warred within Terrence as he approached the door. He raised his hand to knock, but something held him back. The whispers grew more distinct, and with a jolt, Terrence realized there were two voices, one unmistakably male. Without conscious thought, his hand moved to the doorknob. In the split second before he turned it, a part of Terrence's mind screamed at him to stop, to walk away, to preserve the sanctity of trust between father and daughter. But that voice was drowned out by a rising tide of parental concern and an irrational surge of anger at the thought of some boy in his daughter's room. The door swung open. Time seemed to freeze as Terrence's mind struggled to process the scene before him. On Ivy's bed lay his daughter and stepson, their entangled limbs in state of undress, leaving no doubt as to the nature of their activities. For a heartbeat, the tableau held. Terrence in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and dawning rage. Ivy and Callum, their eyes wide with fear and guilt, scrambling to cover themselves. Then, like a dam bursting, chaos erupted. Terrence's world narrowed to a pinpoint of fury and betrayal. "What the hell is going on here?" he thundered, his eyes darting between Ivy and Callum, who were frantically pulling on discarded clothing. But Terrence was beyond explanations. He rounded on Callum, who stood frozen. "You," he snarled, jabbing a finger at his stepson's chest. "How dare you? In my house with my daughter." With a roar of incoherent rage, Terrence lunged at Callum, his hands closing around the young man's throat. They stumbled backwards, crashing into Ivy's desk, sending books and ornaments clattering to the floor. Ivy screamed, pleading with her father to stop, but her words fell on deaf ears. Terrence's world had contracted to this single act of violence, his fingers tightening as Callum's face turned an alarming shade of purple. In desperation, Callum's hand scrabbled across the desk, closing around a heavy crystal paperweight. With the last of his strength, he brought it crashing against the side of his stepfather's head. Terrence's grip loosened as he staggered, blood streaming from the gash on his temple. But the blow had only served to further enrage him. He tackled Callum to the ground. The two men grappled on the floor, a frenzied tangle of limbs and fury. In the chaotic struggle, Terrence's hand closed once more around Callum's throat. Flined with rage and bleeding profusely, he squeezed with all his might. Callum's struggles grew weaker, his eyes bulging as he gasped for air that wouldn't come. Ivy's screams faded to background noise as Terrence poured every ounce of his betrayal and anger into his grip. It wasn't until Callum's body went limp beneath him that the red mist began to clear from his vision. Slowly, horrifyingly, the reality of what he had done began to sink in. Terrence released his grip and scrambled backwards, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he stared at the motionless form of his stepson. The aftermath of Callum's death plunged the Blackwood household into a nightmare of panic, guilt, and desperate decision-making. Terrence, his clothes spattered with blood and his mind reeling, stared at the lifeless body of his stepson as Ivy's hysterical sobs filled the room. "We have to call the police," Ivy choked out between gasps, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. Terrence cut her off, his tone shifting from shock to a cold, calculated calm that chilled Ivy to her core. "Listen to me very carefully," he said. "This was an accident, a terrible, tragic accident, but if the police come now, they won't see it that way. They'll destroy our family, our lives, everything we've built." Ivy stared at her father, barely recognizing the man before her. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "We need to clean this up," Terrence replied, his mind already racing through scenarios. "Your mother can never know what really happened here. Do you understand?" For a moment, Ivy looked as though she might refuse, but then, whether out of shock, fear, or some twisted sense of loyalty, she nodded. The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. Terrence, drawing on skills he never knew he possessed, methodically erased all traces of the struggle from Ivy's room. Flood-stained carpets were torn up, furniture rearranged, and incriminating items bagged for disposal. Ivy, still in a state of shock, followed her father's instructions mechanically. She scrubbed surfaces, laundered clothes, and helped move Callum's body, wrapped in a tarp, to the garage. As twilight descended on Maple Grove, Terrence made a series of phone calls to his secretary, canceling all appointments for the next few days due to a family emergency. To Lorelei, his voice carefully modulated to convey concern rather than guilt, asking if she'd heard from Callum. To the local police, reporting his stepson missing, his tone a masterclass in worried parental concern. When Lorelei returned home, she found Terrence and Ivy seated in the living room, their faces grave.
Terrence spun a tale of Callum storming out after an argument, of unanswered calls and growing worry. Ivy, her eyes red-rimmed from tears that were all too real, corroborated her father's story with a nod. As night fell, the Blackwood house became a hub of anxious activity. Friends and neighbors, alerted to Callum's disappearance, arrived with casseroles and words of support. Police officers came and went, taking statements and assuring the family that they were doing everything possible to locate the missing young man. Through it all, Terrence maintained his facade of concerned stepfather, his arm around a distraught Lorelei, his voice steady as he answered questions and thanked well-wishers. Only Ivy, watching her father with a mixture of fear and disbelief, knew the terrible truth that lay behind his performance. As the last visitors departed, and Lorelei finally succumbed to exhaustion, Terrence pulled Ivy aside. "Remember," he murmured, "this is to protect our family." Ivy, trapped in a nightmare of her own making, could only nod, sealing their pact of silence. As days stretched into weeks with no sign of the young man, the initial worry gave way to darker speculations. Detective Elias Thorne, a veteran of the police department, took charge of the investigation. A methodical and perceptive investigator, Thorne had seen his fair share of missing persons cases, but something about this one nagged at his instincts. His first formal interview with the Blackwood family took place in their immaculate living room, the atmosphere heavy with tension, barely masked by Southern hospitality. Lorelei, her eyes red-rimmed and hands clasping a barely touched cup of tea, recounted the last time she had seen her son. Thorne's gaze shifted to Terrence, noting the man's composed demeanor. "Mr. Blackwood, you reported having an argument with Callum the day he disappeared. Can you tell me more about that?" Terrence's response was measured, rehearsed to perfection in the dark hours of sleepless nights. "It was nothing serious," he explained. "Just a disagreement about Callum's career plans. I wanted him to consider joining the family business, but he was set on pursuing his own path. I may have pushed too hard." "And you, Miss Blackwood?" he asked, turning to Ivy. "Did you witness this argument?" Ivy, her face a mask of carefully cultivated grief, shook her head. "I was at work. When I got home, Callum was already gone." As the interview progressed, Thorne probed gently but persistently, noting the family's reactions. Lorelei's genuine distress, Terrence's controlled responses, and Ivy's withdrawn demeanor all painted a complex picture that the detective couldn't quite decipher. In the days that followed, Thorne and his team delved deeper into Callum's life. They interviewed friends, colleagues from his internship, and even ex-girlfriends. A portrait emerged of a young man with ambition, charm, and no apparent reason to vanish without a trace. Yet as the investigation progressed, inconsistencies began to surface. Callum's phone records showed no outgoing calls or messages on the day of his disappearance. His car, found parked at a local trailhead, yielded no useful evidence. And most puzzlingly, none of his friends corroborated the story of plans to meet up on the day he vanished. As Detective Thorne pinned another lead to the growing caseboard in the precinct, he couldn't shake the feeling that the key to this mystery lay within the walls of their house. As weeks turned into months, the facade of normalcy at the Blackwood residence began to crack under the weight of their shared secret. Terrence threw himself into work with renewed vigor, his aggressive expansion of development raising eyebrows in local business circles. Lorelei's once vibrant social life withered as she retreated into a shell of grief and confusion. And Ivy, haunted by the dual specters of loss and complicity, withdrew from friends and studies alike. It was Ivy who first showed signs of breaking under the strain. Her nights were plagued by vivid nightmares, her days by a gnawing guilt that threatened to consume her. The sight of her father going about his life as if nothing had happened filled her with a mixture of awe and revulsion. One particularly bad night, after waking from a dream of Callum's accusing eyes, Ivy found herself in the kitchen, a glass of water trembling in her hand. She didn't hear Lorelei enter until her stepmother spoke, making her jump. "Can't sleep either?" Lorelei asked softly, her own face etched with the lines of chronic insomnia. Something in Lorelei's gentle tone, so reminiscent of Callum, broke through Ivy's carefully constructed walls. Before she could stop herself, words began to spill out. Disjointed at first, then in a torrent of confession. Lorelei listened, her face a canvas of shifting emotions, disbelief, horror, and finally a devastating understanding. When Ivy finally fell silent, tears streaming down her face, Lorelei did something unexpected.
She pulled her stepdaughter into a tight embrace. "I knew," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I knew about you and Callum. I should have said something, should have stopped it. This is my fault too." As dawn broke over Maple Grove, they made a pact of their own to confront Terrence and bring the truth to light. Terrence's reaction to their united front was explosive. His carefully maintained composure shattered as he raged against their betrayal, his words a toxic mix of threats and pleas for understanding. It was in this moment of unguarded fury that Detective Thorne, arriving for a follow-up interview, overheard the damning confession through the open window of his unmarked car. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Police swarmed the Blackwood residence, securing the scene and separating the family members for questioning. Terrence, realizing the game was up, retreated into stony silence, requesting a lawyer. Ivy and Lorelei, however, unburdened by their confession, provided full statements. As the truth came to light, the community of Maple Grove reeled from the revelations. The illicit relationship between step-siblings, Lorelei's silent knowledge, and Terrence's fatal outburst painted a picture of a family torn apart by secrets and lies. In the midst of the chaos, Detective Thorne focused on the grim task at hand. With Terrence's reluctant cooperation, Callum's body was recovered from its hasty grave in a remote wooded area. The discovery brought a measure of closure to Lorelei, even as it sealed the case against her husband. The case against Terrence Blackwood seemed airtight, built on physical evidence and corroborating testimonies. Yet, as the trial approached, a new development threatened to upend the prosecution's carefully constructed narrative. Amidst the mountain of evidence being processed, a forensics technician made a startling discovery. DNA found under Callum's fingernails didn't match Terrence's profile. Instead, it pointed to an unknown male contributor. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Detective Thorne, his certainty shaken, ordered a re-examination of all evidence. As the team delved deeper, more inconsistencies emerged. The angle of bruising on Callum's neck suggested a left-handed attacker, while Terrence was right-handed. Fibers found on the body didn't match those from the Blackwood home. Pressure mounted on the prosecution as these findings came to light. The defense, sensing an opportunity, pushed for all charges against Terrence to be dropped. However, the judge ruled that given the confessions and circumstantial evidence, the trial would proceed. Ivy and Lorelei, their united front beginning to crack under the strain of uncertainty, found themselves questioning their own memories of that fateful day. Had they been too quick to accept Terrence's guilt, blinded by their own complicity in the events leading up to Callum's death? As the trial date loomed, all parties involved grappled with the implications of this new information. The truth, it seemed, was far more complex than anyone had initially believed. In the courtroom, battle lines were drawn, with both prosecution and defense preparing to argue their interpretations of the increasingly convoluted evidence. The courtroom was packed on the day Terrence Blackwood was scheduled to take the stand. The air thrummed with tension as he was sworn in, his once commanding presence diminished by months in custody. As questioning began, Terrence's responses were measured, his demeanor calm, until the defense attorney broached the subject of the new DNA evidence. Terrence's composure cracked, his eyes darting to where Ivy sat in the gallery. In that moment, something seemed to break within him. To the shock of everyone present, he began to speak, his words pouring out in a torrent of confession, but not the one anyone expected. "I didn't kill Callum," Terrence declared, his voice raw with emotion, "but I am responsible for his death." He went on to describe the events of that day, but with a crucial difference. When he had walked in on Ivy and Callum, he admitted he had indeed been enraged, but it was Ivy, in a panic to protect her lover and their secret, who had lashed out violently. "I walked in and saw them together," Terrence recounted, his words echoing in the stunned silence of the courtroom. "I was angry, yes, but before I could even speak, Ivy grabbed the paperweight. She struck Callum again and again. By the time I pulled her off, it was too late." The courtroom erupted into chaos as Terrence described how, in a moment of paternal instinct, he had decided to protect his daughter. He had sent a hysterical Ivy to clean herself up, while he staged the scene to implicate himself, believing he could better weather the storm of a police investigation. "I never imagined it would go this far," he concluded, tears streaming down his face. "I was trying to protect my little girl, but I see now that I've destroyed us all." As Terrence's words hung in the air, all eyes turned to Ivy. Her face had drained of color, her body rigid with shock. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, she could only manage a barely audible whisper, It's true. In the gallery, Lorelei collapsed into silent sobs, the full weight of her family's destruction finally too much to bear. Detective Thorne, his case shattered but his instincts vindicated, began the mental process of reconstructing the investigation. As Terrence was led from the stand, the courtroom remained in stunned silence, grappling with this final devastating twist in a case that had already defied expectations at every turn. The revelation of Ivy's culpability and Terrence's false confession threw the trial into disarray. The judge declared a mistrial, and both prosecution and defense scrambled to reassess their strategies in light of the new information. Ivy was immediately taken into custody, her bail hearing scheduled for the following week. The prosecution, caught off guard by the turn of events, requested time to review the evidence and potentially file new charges against both Ivy and Terrence. Ivy's defense team quickly began building a case around temporary insanity and crime of passion, emphasizing her youth and the shocking circumstances that led to her actions. They also didn't hesitate to shine a light on the questionable dynamics within the Blackwood household that had allowed the relationship between step-siblings to develop unchecked. The trials of Ivy Blackwood and Terrence Blackwood, though separate, were inextricably linked in the public consciousness. Ivy's trial came first, a somber affair that saw the once vibrant young woman appearing pale and withdrawn in the defendant's box. Her defense team, as planned, pursued a strategy of temporary insanity, bringing in expert witnesses to testify about the psychological impact of forbidden love and the fear of discovery. The prosecution painted a different picture, portraying Ivy as a calculating individual who had engaged in an illicit relationship and then committed murder to keep it hidden. They emphasized the brutality of the attack and Ivy's subsequent participation in the cover-up. Key testimony came from Lorelei, who spoke of her suspicions about Ivy and Callum's relationship and her regret at not intervening. Her words, delivered through tears, seemed to sway some jurors but alienate others who saw her inaction as complicity. After days of deliberation, the juries in both trials returned with their verdicts, bringing the legal saga of the Blackwood family to its conclusion. Ivy Blackwood was found guilty of second-degree murder, with the jury rejecting the insanity plea but acknowledging the crime's unpremeditated nature. The judge, taking into account Ivy's age and the unusual circumstances of the case, sentenced her to 18 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 12 years. Terrence Blackwood was found guilty on charges of obstruction of justice and filing a false report. The judge, noting the unique circumstances in Terrence's eventual confession, sentenced him to 5 years in prison, with 2 years suspended. As the Blackwoods were led from the courtroom for the last time, Maple Grove began the long process of healing and reflection, grappling with the knowledge that even in the most seemingly perfect communities, darkness can lurk behind closed doors. In the quiet streets of Oak Ridge Heights, a picturesque suburban enclave, the Blackwood residence stood as a beacon of domestic bliss. To the casual observer, Zephyr and Lorelei Blackwood epitomized the American dream: successful careers, a beautifully maintained craftsman home, and a marriage that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. Their neighbors often remarked on the couple's apparent devotion to one another, evidenced by their frequent dinner parties and synchronized jogging routines. But beneath the polished veneer of their seemingly perfect life, the Blackwoods harbored a secret that would ultimately lead to their undoing. For the past 2 years, Zephyr and Lorelei had been active participants in a local swinging community, a lifestyle choice that promised to add excitement and passion to their decade-long marriage. At first, their foray into the world of consensual non-monogamy seemed to reinvigorate their relationship. They spoke of feeling closer, more honest, and more in love than ever before. However, as with many things that glitter, the reality of their chosen path was far more complex and fraught with danger than either could have anticipated. What began as a mutual adventure in sexual exploration would eventually expose deep-seated insecurities and long-buried resentments. This is the story of how a couple's search for excitement and fulfillment led to jealousy, rage, and murder. Zephyr Blackwood was a rising star in the tech scene. With his sharp intellect and innovative ideas, he had quickly climbed the corporate ladder at a leading software company. Colleagues described him as driven, charismatic and occasionally intense. Standing tall in a runner's physique, Zephyr turned heads wherever he went. Despite his professional success, those closest to him noted a persistent undercurrent of insecurity, stemming from a childhood marked by his parents' messy divorce and his father's subsequent absence. Lorelei Blackwood was Zephyr's perfect complement. A talented freelance graphic designer, she balanced her husband's type A personality with her more laid-back, creative approach to life. With her warm eyes, infectious laugh, and curves that defied her dedication to yoga, Lorelei was the kind of person who made friends easily and kept them for life. Growing up in a large, boisterous family, she valued connection and openness above all else. The couple met during their senior year at the university. Zephyr was immediately drawn to Lorelei's free spirit and artistic talent, while she found herself captivated by his ambition and hidden vulnerability. Their whirlwind romance culminated in a beachside proposal just 6 months after graduation, and they married a year later in a lavish ceremony that was the talk of their social circle. For the first 7 years of their marriage, Zephyr and Lorelei seemed to have it all. They traveled extensively, built successful careers, and created a home that was the envy of their friends. However, as they approached their mid-30s, a sense of restlessness began to creep into their relationship. The passion that had once burned so brightly had dimmed to a comfortable but uninspiring glow. It was Lorelei who first broached the subject of exploring new avenues in their sex life. Always the more sexually adventurous of the two, she suggested they attend a few workshops on tantric practices and BDSM. Zephyr, eager to please his wife and reignite their spark, agreed enthusiastically. These workshops opened up new channels of communication between the couple, and they found themselves discussing fantasies and desires they had never before shared. It was during one of these conversations that the topic of swinging first arose. Lorelei had read about it online and was intrigued by the idea of consensual non-monogamy. Zephyr, initially hesitant, warmed to the concept as Lorelei painted a picture of increased intimacy and shared adventures. After months of discussion, research, and soul-searching, the Blackwoods decided to take the plunge. They created profiles on swinger websites, attended a few meet-and-greet events, and finally participated in their first full swap with another couple. The experience was exhilarating, and for a time it seemed to breathe new life into their marriage. Little did they know that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to tragedy. The Blackwoods' entry into the world of swinging was marked by a mix of nervous excitement and cautious optimism. Their first experience, a soft swap with a couple they met through a reputable swinger website, exceeded their expectations. The evening was filled with laughter, flirtation, and a level of sexual tension that neither Zephyr nor Lorelei had experienced in years. As they drove home, hands intertwined, they couldn't stop grinning at each other, already planning their next encounter. Over the next few months, Zephyr and Lorelei became regulars in the swinging scene. They attended parties at upscale clubs, participated in intimate gatherings at private homes, and even organized a few events of their own. Their social circle expanded rapidly, filled with like-minded couples who shared their desire for excitement and sexual exploration. Lorelei, in particular, thrived in this new environment. Her natural charisma and open-mindedness made her a favorite among their swinging friends. She reveled in the attention she received from both men and women, and her confidence soared. Zephyr, too, seemed to flourish initially. He enjoyed the ego boost that came from other women finding him attractive, and he took pride in having a wife that others desired. The couple's sex life, both with others and between themselves, reached new heights of passion and intensity. They found themselves experimenting with fantasies and kinks they had never before considered. Lorelei would often joke that they were having more sex now than they did in their first year of marriage. As they became more comfortable with the lifestyle, the Blackwoods began to form deeper connections with some of the couples they met. They particularly clicked with Ether and Nova Sterling, a pair of free-spirited artists who had been in the swinging scene for years. The four of them often got together for dinner and drinks, which would invariably lead to steamy encounters that left everyone satisfied. However, as the months wore on, subtle changes began to occur in the dynamics of Zephyr and Lorelei's relationship. While Lorelei continued to embrace the lifestyle with enthusiasm, Zephyr started to show signs of discomfort. He began to notice the way other men looked at his wife, the ease with which she flirted and connected with their swinging partners. What had once been a source of pride now stirred uncomfortable feelings in the pit of his stomach. Zephyr found himself paying closer attention to Lorelei's interactions, especially with Ether Sterling. He couldn't help but notice the lingering touches, the inside jokes, the way Lorelei's eyes seemed to light up in Ether's presence. Rational thought told him that this was all part of the game, that Lorelei always came home with him at the end of the night. But a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts and fueled his growing insecurity. Despite his misgivings, Zephyr kept his feelings to himself. He didn't want to disappoint Lorelei or appear weak in front of their new friends. Instead, he threw himself into the lifestyle with renewed vigor, as if trying to prove something to himself and others. He initiated more encounters, suggested wilder scenarios, and pushed his boundaries further than he was truly comfortable with. Lorelei, caught up in the excitement and new experiences, failed to notice the subtle changes in her husband's behavior. She interpreted his increased enthusiasm as a sign that he was enjoying the lifestyle as much as she was. In her mind, swinging had brought them closer together, opening up new avenues of communication and shared experiences. As their second anniversary in the lifestyle approached, the Blackwoods were seen as a success story in their swinging circle. They were attractive, fun, and seemingly more in love than ever. But beneath the surface, the seeds of discord had been sown. The very lifestyle that had reinvigorated their marriage was now silently driving a wedge between them, setting the stage for the tragic events that were to come. The first signs of trouble in the Blackwoods' seemingly perfect arrangement appeared subtly at first. Zephyr began to make offhand comments about cutting back on their swinging activities, suggesting they focus more on their own relationship. Lorelei, interpreting this as a passing mood, gently brushed off his concerns and encouraged him to embrace the freedom and excitement they had discovered. As weeks passed, Zephyr's jealousy grew more pronounced. He started to question Lorelei about her interactions with other men, particularly Ether Sterling. His inquiries, initially casual, became more frequent and intense, where once he had enjoyed watching Lorelei with other partners, he now found himself averting his eyes, a knot forming in his stomach. Lorelei, for her part, struggled to understand the change in her husband. She repeatedly assured him of her love and commitment, emphasizing that their adventures in swinging were purely physical and did not threaten their emotional bond. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears as Zephyr's insecurities deepened. The tension between them began to spill over into their daily lives. Arguments that started about swinging quickly devolved into broader accusations and recriminations. Zephyr would bring up past grievances, questioning Lorelei's fidelity even before they entered the lifestyle. Lorelei, frustrated by what she saw as Zephyr's irrational behavior, found herself becoming defensive and withdrawn. Their professional lives started to suffer as well. Zephyr, usually laser-focused at work, became distracted and irritable. His colleagues noticed the change, whispering about possible troubles at home. Lorelei, whose work required creativity and a positive outlook, found it increasingly difficult to meet deadlines and satisfy clients. Despite the growing discord, Lorelei was reluctant to give up the lifestyle that had brought her so much joy and self-discovery. She suggested they take a break from group activities and focus on one-on-one encounters, hoping this would ease Zephyr's jealousy. But even this compromise led to conflict, with Zephyr accusing Lorelei of trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. As their arguments intensified, the Blackwoods' facade of domestic bliss began to crumble. In a last-ditch effort to salvage their marriage, Zephyr suggested they seek counseling. Lorelei agreed, hoping that a professional could help them navigate the complex emotions stirred up by their foray into non-monogamy. However, finding a therapist who was both qualified and non-judgmental about their lifestyle proved challenging, further adding to their frustration. As the date of an upcoming swinger party hosted by the Sterlings approached, the tension in the Blackwood household reached a fever pitch. Lorelei was determined to attend, seeing it as an opportunity to reconnect with friends and reaffirm their place in the community. Zephyr, conflicted and resentful, reluctantly agreed to go, setting the stage for the tragic events that would unfold. The evening of May 15th dawned warm and clear, a perfect spring day. As twilight approached, the Blackwoods began preparing for the Sterlings' party, with an undercurrent of tension thrumming between them. Lorelei hummed to herself as she applied her makeup, choosing a slinky black dress that accentuated her curves. Zephyr, watching her from the doorway, felt a familiar mix of desire and dread coiling in his stomach. They arrived at the Sterlings' upscale loft just as the party was getting started. The spacious apartment was bathed in soft, colorful lights, with sensual music pulsing through hidden speakers. Couples and singles mingled, drinks in hand, the air thick with anticipation and pheromones. Nova Sterling, resplendent in a shimmering gold jumpsuit, greeted them warmly. Zephyr couldn't help but notice how her embrace with Lorelei lingered, the two women exchanging knowing smiles. Ether appeared moments later, clapping Zephyr on the back before placing a gentle kiss on Lorelei's cheek. The knot in Zephyr's stomach tightened. As the night progressed, Zephyr found himself growing increasingly agitated. He watched as Lorelei flitted from group to group, her laughter carrying across the room. She seemed to be in her element, radiating confidence and sensuality. In contrast, Zephyr felt awkward and out of place, nursing the same drink for hours as he observed the interactions around him. The party began to shift gears as couples started to pair off or form small groups, disappearing into the various playrooms the Sterlings had set up. Zephyr lost sight of Lorelei for a while, his anxiety spiking as he searched the crowded loft. He finally spotted her in deep conversation with Ether, their heads close together as they spoke in low tones. Unable to contain himself any longer, Zephyr approached the pair. He caught the tail end of their conversation, something about meeting up later in the week for coffee. Lorelei's eyes widened slightly as she noticed Zephyr, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before she composed herself. Zephyr, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, suggested it was time to leave. Lorelei protested, arguing that the night hasn't ended. Their disagreement, though conducted in hushed tones, drew curious glances from nearby guests. Ether, sensing the tension, tried to smooth things over, but his intervention only seemed to irritate Zephyr further. As the argument threatened to escalate, Nova appeared, smoothly inserting herself into the situation. With practiced ease, she guided Zephyr and Lorelei to a quiet corner of the loft, encouraging them to take a moment to cool off. She offered them water and gentle words of advice, reminding them of the community's emphasis on open communication and mutual respect. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Nova's intervention had diffused the situation. Zephyr took a deep breath, visibly trying to calm himself. Lorelei reached out, squeezing his hand in a conciliatory gesture. But as they stood to rejoin the party, Zephyr caught sight of Ether watching them intently. Something in the other man's gaze, concern, pity, or perhaps something else entirely, caused Zephyr's tenuous control to snap. In a cold, clipped voice, he announced that he and Lorelei were leaving. This time, Lorelei didn't argue. She could see the storm brewing behind Zephyr's eyes, and knew that staying would only lead to a scene. Apologizing profusely to Nova and avoiding Ether's gaze, Lorelei allowed Zephyr to lead her out of the loft. The drive home was fraught with silence, the tension between them so thick it was almost suffocating. Lorelei stared out the window, her earlier vivacity replaced by a wary exhaustion. Zephyr gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his jaw clenched as he navigated the nearly empty streets. As they pulled into their driveway, neither made a move to exit the car immediately. For a long moment they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them. Finally, Lorelei turned to Zephyr, her voice soft but firm as she said, "We need to talk about this. We can't go on like this." Zephyr nodded stiffly, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Without a word, he got out of the car and headed for the front door. Lorelei followed, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the conversation to come would likely change their lives forever. Neither of them could have predicted just how prophetic that feeling would prove to be. As soon as the front door closed behind them, the facade of calm they had maintained in public crumbled. Zephyr rounded on Lorelei, his face contorted with a mix of anger and pain. The words tumbled out of him in a torrent of accusations and grievances, all the doubts and fears he had been harboring for months, finally finding voice. He raged about her behavior at the party, the way she had flirted openly with Ether and others. He brought up past encounters, dissecting them with jealous scrutiny, finding evidence of betrayal in the smallest gestures and glances. His voice rose as he spoke of the coffee plans he had overheard, convinced it was proof of an ongoing affair. Lorelei, initially stunned by the ferocity of Zephyr's outburst, found her own anger rising to meet his. She defended herself vehemently, reminding him that openness and honesty had always been the foundation of their relationship and their foray into swinging. She accused him of hypocrisy, pointing out his own enthusiastic participation in their lifestyle choice until recently. Their argument echoed through the house, a cacophony of hurt feelings and misunderstandings. Lorelei tried to reason with Zephyr, to make him see that his jealousy was unfounded, but her words seemed to bounce off him without making an impact. In frustration, she brought up his own dalliances within the swinging community, asking why it was acceptable for him, but not for her. This only served to enrage Zephyr further. He advanced on Lorelei, his tall frame looming over her as he backed her into a corner of their living room. Lorelei, feeling trapped and increasingly frightened by Zephyr's uncharacteristic aggression, attempted to push past him. In that moment, something in Zephyr snapped. As Lorelei tried to move away, he grabbed her arms, his fingers digging into her skin with bruising force. Lorelei cried out in pain and surprise, her eyes wide with disbelief as she stared at the man she had loved for over a decade, suddenly unrecognizable in his fury. She struggled against his grip, her own anger giving way to fear as she realized how out of control the situation had become. Zephyr, lost in a haze of jealousy and rage, didn't seem to hear her pleas to let go. In her desperation to break free, Lorelei's hand caught Zephyr across the face, her nails leaving angry red scratches on his cheek. The physical contact seemed to push Zephyr over the edge. With a roar of inarticulate rage, he shoved Lorelei hard. She stumbled backwards, her heel catching on the edge of the area rug. Time seemed to slow as she fell, her arms flailing as she tried to catch herself. But there was nothing to break her fall, and her head struck the corner of the solid oak coffee table with a sickening thud. The sound seemed to snap Zephyr out of his frenzy. He stood frozen, watching in horror as Lorelei crumpled to the floor, a small pool of blood beginning to form beneath her head. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Zephyr's ragged breathing. For several long moments, he remained rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Then, as if moving through molasses, he stumbled towards Lorelei's motionless form. He fell to his knees beside her, hands shaking as he reached out to touch her. Her skin was still warm, but as he frantically searched for a pulse, he found nothing. The reality of the situation crashed over Zephyr like a tidal wave. He had done the unthinkable. In a moment of uncontrolled anger, he had taken the life of the woman he loved. As the enormity of his actions began to sink in, Zephyr let out a howl of anguish, cradling Lorelei's lifeless body in his arms as tears streamed down his face. In the quiet suburban street outside, a neighbor who had been walking his dog paused, startled by the sound of despair emanating from the Blackwood residence. It was a cry that would haunt the neighborhood for years to come, marking the moment when a loving marriage ended in unimaginable tragedy. The early morning calm of Oak Ridge Heights was shattered by the arrival of police cruisers and an ambulance, their lights painting the tree-lined street in alternating flashes of red and blue. Neighbors emerged from their homes as they watched the unfolding scene, with a mix of curiosity and dread. Detective Rhiannon Frost, a veteran of Homicide Division, arrived on the scene shortly after the first responders. As she ducked under the crime scene tape, she was struck by the contrast between the manicured exterior of the Blackwood home and the chaos that awaited inside. The living room, once a showcase of tasteful decor, now bore the unmistakable signs of violence. The coffee table was askew. A lamp lay shattered on the floor, and at the center of it all was the body of Lorelei Blackwood, partially covered by a sheet. Forensic technicians moved around the room with practiced efficiency, photographing and collecting evidence. Frost's keen eyes took in every detail. Dr. Kai Nakamura briefed her on their initial findings. The cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the head, likely from impact with the corner of the coffee table. Signs of a struggle were evident, including bruising on the victim's arms and defensive wounds on her hands. As Nakamura spoke, Frost's attention was drawn to the figure of Zephyr Blackwood, seated on a dining room chair, his head in his hands. He was still wearing the clothes from the previous night's party, now rumpled and stained. A uniformed officer stood nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the distraught husband. Frost approached Zephyr, her experienced gaze noting his scratched cheek and the smears of blood on his shirt. In a voice hoarse from crying, he began to speak, weaving a tale of a party, an argument, and a tragic accident. As she listened, Frost's instincts told her there was more to the story than Zephyr was revealing. His account seemed rehearsed, lacking the raw emotion one would expect from a man who had just lost his wife. She made a mental note to dig deeper into the couple's background and recent activities. Outside, the neighbors huddled in small groups, exchanging shocked whispers and speculative glances. The Blackwoods had always seemed so happy, so perfect. What could have gone so terribly wrong? In the days following Lorelai Blackwood's death, Detective Frost and her team worked tirelessly to piece together the events that led to that fateful night. Their investigation began to reveal a complex web of relationships and hidden tensions that lay beneath the surface of the Blackwoods' seemingly idyllic life. Interviews with friends and colleagues painted a picture of a couple who had recently embraced the swinging lifestyle. While many expressed surprise at this revelation, a select few provided valuable insights into the dynamics of the Blackwoods' open marriage. Nova Sterling, in particular, proved to be a crucial witness, recounting the argument she had witnessed at the party and the obvious tension between Zephyr and Lorelai. As the detectives delved deeper, they uncovered a trail of digital evidence that shed light on the couple's private life. Text messages and emails revealed Zephyr's growing jealousy and Lorelai's increasing frustration with his behavior. Particularly damning was a series of messages between Lorelai and Ether Sterling, discussing Zephyr's recent mood swings and Lorelai's concerns about the future of her marriage. Forensic analysis of the crime scene yielded more damning evidence against Zephyr. The angle and force of Lorelai's fatal injury were inconsistent with a simple fall. DNA evidence under Lorelai's fingernails matched Zephyr's, corroborating the signs of a struggle. Furthermore, toxicology reports showed that while Lorelai had a modest amount of alcohol in her system, Zephyr's blood alcohol level had been significantly higher, suggesting he may have been more impaired than he initially claimed. As the investigation progressed, Detective Frost brought Zephyr in for a series of intense interrogations. Under the relentless pressure of questioning, his carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. Inconsistencies in his story emerged, and his demeanor shifted from grief-stricken widow to a man consumed by guilt and fear. In a dramatic turn of events, Ether Sterling came forward with additional information. He revealed that Lorelai had confided in him about her plans to leave Zephyr, citing his increasingly controlling and jealous behavior. This revelation provided a possible motive for Zephyr's actions, suggesting that the murder may have been premeditated rather than a heat-of-the-moment crime of passion. The investigation also uncovered financial records indicating that Zephyr had recently inquired about the couple's life insurance policies, adding another layer of suspicion to his actions. Friends reported that he had been under increasing stress at work, with rumors of potential layoffs circulating in his company. As the evidence mounted, the prosecution began to build a strong case against Zephyr Blackwood. The narrative that emerged was one of a man who, faced with the prospect of losing both his wife and his carefully cultivated image of success, had lashed out in a jealous rage with tragic consequences. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate the city and beyond, promising to expose the hidden world of suburban swingers and the devastating consequences of jealousy unleashed. Prosecutor Vivian Zhao opened the proceedings with a powerful statement, painting a vivid picture of a marriage destroyed by jealousy and a woman's life cut tragically short. She promised to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Zephyr Blackwood had murdered his wife in a fit of rage, driven by his inability to control her and his fear of losing her. The defense countered with a narrative of a tragic accident, the result of a loving marriage strained by lifestyle choices that neither party was fully prepared for. Holloway sought to portray Zephyr as a devoted husband, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. As the trial progressed, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Nova and Ether Sterling provided crucial testimony about the Blackwoods' involvement in the swinging community and the visible tension between them on the night of Lorelai's death. Their accounts were both illuminating and scandalous, causing a stir in the courtroom and generating salacious headlines. Forensic experts presented detailed analyses of the crime scene, with Dr. Kai Nakamura delivering damning testimony about the nature of Lorelai's injuries. His assertion that the fatal wound was inconsistent with an accidental fall dealt a significant blow to the defense's case. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Zephyr Blackwood himself took the stand. Under Holloway's careful guidance, he presented himself as a man deeply in love with his wife, who had agreed to explore swinging to please her. He spoke of his growing discomfort with the lifestyle and his fears that he was losing Lorelai to it. However, under Zhao's relentless cross-examination, Zephyr's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. She confronted him with text messages, emails, and witness statements that contradicted his version of events. As the questioning intensified, Zephyr's composure slipped,
revealing flashes of the anger and jealousy that had led to that fatal night. The gallery watched in rapt attention as Zephyr struggled to maintain his story under the prosecution's onslaught. His voice cracked as he recounted the final argument with Lorelei, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might break down and confess. But he managed to hold himself together, sticking to his claim of a tragic accident to the end. As the trial neared its conclusion, both the prosecution and defense delivered impassioned closing arguments. So urged the jury to see through Zephyr's lies and hold him accountable for the brutal act that had ended Lorelei's life. Holloway, in turn, pleaded for understanding, asking the jury to consider the complex emotions and circumstances that had led to this tragedy. With the evidence presented and arguments made, the case was turned over to the jury. As they filed out to begin deliberations, a tense hush fell over the courtroom. The fate of Zephyr Blackwood now rested in their hands. In the end, the jury took less than 6 hours to reach a verdict. Zephyr Blackwood was found guilty of second-degree murder, a decision that sent shockwaves through the community and brought a measure of closure to Lorelei's grieving family and friends. The judge, citing the brutal nature of the crime and Zephyr's lack of remorse, sentenced him to 25 years to life in prison. The aftermath of the trial left an indelible mark on the community. The case had exposed the hidden world of suburban swingers, leading to heated debates about morality, trust, and the nature of modern relationships. Some couples who had been part of the lifestyle quietly distanced themselves, while others became vocal advocates for ethical non-monogamy, emphasizing the importance of communication and consent. In the end, the tragic story of Zephyr and Lorelei Blackwood served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the strongest relationships can be undone by jealousy, mistrust, and uncontrolled anger. Their story would be remembered not just as a sensational crime, but as a complex human tragedy, born from the eternal struggle between love, desire, and the need for control. At the heart of this tragic tale were two sisters, Jessica and Cassandra Lawrence, whose lives had been intertwined in a complex web of love, rivalry, and resentment since childhood. Cassandra, the elder of the two, had always been the golden child, beautiful, accomplished, and married to the charming and successful architect, Dominic Blunt. Their union was the envy of Millhaven, a seemingly perfect marriage that everyone aspired to emulate. Jessica and Cassandra were born into a family of moderate means, their father a local fisherman, and their mother a schoolteacher. From an early age, it was clear that the two sisters were as different as night and day. Cassandra, with her gentle demeanor, was the pride of her parents. She excelled in school, was beloved by her teachers, and seemed to navigate the social waters of Millhaven with effortless grace. Her path in life seemed predetermined. She would go to college, find a respectable job, and settle down with a good man to start a family of her own. Jessica, however, was a force of nature from the moment she could walk. She possessed a wild spirit that both intrigued and unsettled those around her. While equally intelligent as her sister, Jessica's academic achievements were overshadowed by her rebellious nature and penchant for pushing boundaries. As they grew older, the differences between the sisters only became more pronounced. Cassandra pursued a degree in education, following in her mother's footsteps, while Jessica bounced between various majors, never quite finding her place. It was during this time that Jessica's manipulative tendencies began to surface. She would charm her way out of trouble, using her wit and allure to bend situations to her advantage. Jessica's relationships were always intense but short-lived. She seemed to thrive on the chaos of new romances, only to grow bored once the initial excitement faded. This pattern left a trail of broken hearts and bitter exes in her wake, further cementing her reputation as the black sheep of Millhaven. Cassandra, meanwhile, had returned to her hometown after college and quickly caught the eye of Dominic Blunt, a rising star in the world of architecture. Dominic had come to Millhaven to oversee the restoration of the town's historic lighthouse, but found himself captivated by the town's gentle beauty, both in its landscape and in Cassandra herself. Their courtship was swift and passionate, culminating in a fairy tale wedding that was the talk of the town for months. Dominic's career continued to flourish, and soon he and Cassandra were living in a beautiful home overlooking the ocean.
their life together seeming like a modern-day fairy tale. But beneath the surface of their perfect marriage, cracks were beginning to form. Cassandra, always the dutiful daughter and wife, found herself yearning for something more. She had given up her own dreams of travel and adventure to settle in Millhaven, and a part of her resented the sacrifices she had made for the sake of her marriage. Dominic, for his part, was battling his own demons. The pressure of his high-profile career and the expectations of small-town life weighed heavily on him. He loved Cassandra deeply, but there were moments when he felt suffocated by the perfection they were expected to maintain. It was into this delicate balance that Jessica re-entered their lives. Having spent years drifting from city to city, she returned to Millhaven, claiming to want to reconnect with her roots. In reality, she was running from yet another failed relationship and mounting debts, seeking refuge in the only place she knew would take her in. Cassandra, ever the loving sister, welcomed Jessica with open arms, offering her a place to stay until she got back on her feet. But as Jessica settled into life in the Blunt household, the dynamics between the three began to shift in subtle yet profound ways. The stage was set for a drama that would shake Millhaven to its very core, forever altering the lives of all involved. At first, her presence seemed to breathe new life into Cassandra and Dominic's relationship. Evenings were filled with laughter and reminiscence as the sisters caught up on lost time, with Dominic playing the role of the attentive husband and brother-in-law. But as days turned to weeks, Jessica's true intentions began to surface. Her eyes would linger on Dominic a moment too long, her casual touches becoming more frequent and deliberate. She would find excuses to be alone with him, asking for help with her car, seeking advice on job applications, or simply catching him in the kitchen late at night when Cassandra had already gone to bed. Dominic, initially oblivious to Jessica's advances, found himself increasingly drawn to her vibrant personality. Where Cassandra was steady and predictable, Jessica was spontaneous and exciting. She listened with rapt attention to his architectural designs, asking insightful questions that made him feel truly understood. In those moments, Dominic felt a spark he hadn't experienced in years. Dominic was a man of principle, devoted to his wife and the life they had built together. He tried to distance himself from Jessica, making excuses to spend more time at the office or taking on additional projects that kept him away from home. Jessica, however, was not so easily deterred. She recognized the internal struggle in Dominic's eyes and saw it as a challenge rather than a deterrent. She began to weave a careful web of seduction, playing on his insecurities and unfulfilled desires. One evening, as Cassandra attended a school board meeting, Jessica orchestrated a seemingly innocent dinner with Dominic. She prepared his favorite meal, opened a bottle of expensive wine, and created an atmosphere of intimacy that was hard to resist. As they talked late into the night, Jessica carefully steered the conversation towards Dominic's passions and dreams, areas where she knew Cassandra had never fully connected with him. Dominic felt a rush of emotions, flattery, desire, and overwhelming guilt. He stammered a response, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But Jessica had already sensed her advantage. She leaned in closer, her hand brushing against his. "Don't you ever wonder what it would be like to be truly understood? To be with someone who sees you for who you really are?" The tension in the room was palpable. Dominic knew he should leave, should put an end to this dangerous game before it went too far. But something kept him rooted to the spot, caught in the gravitational pull of Jessica's allure. As Jessica's lips met his in a passionate kiss, Dominic's resistance crumbled. In that moment, the foundation of his marriage began to crack, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to unimaginable tragedy. The weeks following that fateful night were a blur of stolen moments and mounting guilt for Dominic. What had begun as a momentary lapse in judgment quickly spiraled into a full-blown affair, with Jessica and Dominic finding increasingly creative ways to be together without arousing Cassandra's suspicions. Their rendezvous ranged from hurried encounters in Dominic's office to carefully planned business trips that allowed them to escape the watchful eyes of Millhaven. Jessica reveled in the thrill of their forbidden romance, each secret meeting fueling her sense of triumph over her sister. For Dominic, the affair was an intoxicating mixture of excitement and self-loathing, each encounter leaving him both exhilarated and racked with guilt. Jessica, ever the master manipulator, knew exactly how to keep Dominic ensnared. She played the role of the perfect lover, alternating between passionate temptress and vulnerable confidant. She would listen to his frustrations about work and his unfulfilled ambitions, offering the understanding and validation he craved. "I've never met anyone like you, Dominic," she would whisper in their intimate moments. "You deserve so much more than this small town can offer you." Her words were carefully chosen, planting seeds of discontent in Dominic's mind about his life with Cassandra. She painted vivid pictures of the future they could have together, a life of excitement and passion, free from the constraints of small-town expectations. Dominic found himself increasingly torn between his growing feelings for Jessica and his loyalty to Cassandra. The double life he was leading began to take its toll, manifesting in mood swings and uncharacteristic behavior that didn't go unnoticed by his wife. At home, Dominic's guilt manifested in a mixture of emotional distance and overcompensation. There were days when he could barely look Cassandra in the eye, and others where he would shower her with affection, driven by remorse. He threw himself into his work, taking on more projects than ever before, using his career as both an escape and an excuse for his frequent absences. Jessica, for her part, played the role of the doting sister-in-law to perfection. She would engage Cassandra in long conversations, feigning interest in her day-to-day life while secretly reveling in her deception. There were moments when a flicker of guilt would cross Jessica's face, a brief recognition of the pain she was causing her sister. But these moments were quickly suppressed, overshadowed by her desire for Dominic and her deep-seated need to finally outshine Cassandra. As the affair progressed, the risks they took became greater. They began meeting in more public places, their need for each other overriding their caution. There were close calls, a neighbor who almost caught them in an embrace, a colleague of Cassandra's who saw them dining together in a neighboring town. Each near discovery only added to the intensity of their relationship, the danger becoming part of the allure. But as weeks turned to months, the strain of their deception began to show. Dominic, once energized by the affair, now found himself constantly on edge. The guilt was eating away at him, affecting his work and his relationships with friends and family. He began to question whether the passion he felt for Jessica was worth the destruction of the life he had built with Cassandra. Jessica, sensing Dominic's internal struggle, doubled down on her efforts to keep him engaged. She became more demanding of his time, more insistent in her declarations of love. Her manipulations became more overt, playing on his guilt and his desires in equal measure. As their affair reached its fever pitch, neither Jessica nor Dominic realized that their carefully constructed house of cards was about to come crashing down. The truth, as it often does, was quietly making its way to the surface, ready to shatter the lives of all involved. While Jessica and Dominic were lost in their passionate affair, Cassandra was slowly piecing together a puzzle she never wanted to solve. At first, the changes were subtle. A lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume on Dominic's clothes, hushed phone conversations that would abruptly end when she entered the room, and an emotional distance that seemed to grow with each passing day. Cassandra, ever the optimist, initially chalked these changes up to work stress or a midlife crisis. She tried to bridge the growing gap between them, planning romantic dinners and weekend getaways, only to be met with half-hearted enthusiasm from Dominic. Her sister Jessica, ironically, became her confidant during this time, offering sympathetic ears and reassurances that only served to twist the knife of betrayal deeper. But as weeks turned to months, Cassandra could no longer ignore the nagging voice in the back of her mind. She began to pay closer attention to the inconsistencies in Dominic's stories about late nights at the office and out-of-town meetings. She noticed the way Jessica's eyes would follow Dominic across a room, the barely concealed hunger in her gaze. One afternoon, while doing laundry, Cassandra found a matchbook from a hotel in a neighboring city tucked into the pocket of Dominic's jacket, a hotel she knew wasn't anywhere near his usual business haunts. The discovery sent a chill down her spine, the physical evidence making it impossible to deny her worst fears any longer. Torn between confronting her suspicions and the fear of what she might uncover, Cassandra found herself in a state of constant anxiety. She began to withdraw from friends and colleagues, unable to bear the thought of sharing her suspicions and making them real. Her sleep was plagued by nightmares, and she found herself watching Dominic and Jessica like a hawk, searching for any sign that would confirm or deny her fears. In a moment of desperation, Cassandra even considered hiring a private investigator, but the thought of strangers prying into her private life was too much to bear. Instead, she decided to confront Dominic and Jessica separately, hoping that one of them would crack under the pressure and reveal the truth. Little did Cassandra know that her decision to seek the truth would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to a confrontation more devastating than she could have ever imagined, forever altering the course of all their lives. The day of reckoning arrived on a stormy afternoon in late autumn. She had spent the morning steeling herself for this moment, rehearsing what she would say, how she would remain calm and collected in the face of potential heartbreak. When Dominic walked through the door, shaking rain from his coat, he was met with the sight of his wife standing in the room, her face a mask of barely contained emotion. The tension in the air was palpable, and he knew instantly that their carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. "We need to talk," she began, her voice quavering slightly despite her best efforts. "I know about you and Jessica." The color drained from Dominic's face, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words. In that moment of stunned silence, Cassandra saw the truth written plainly across his features, and her last shred of hope evaporated. "How long?" she demanded, her voice rising. "How long have you been sleeping with my sister?" Dominic's shoulders slumped in defeat. He knew there was no point in denying it any longer. "Cassandra, I'm so sorry, it just happened." Cassandra cut him off with a bitter laugh. "You never meant to?" "What, did you trip and fall into her bed? How could you do this?" The floodgates opened, and months of pent-up suspicion and hurt came pouring out. Cassandra hurled accusations and questions at Dominic, her voice echoing through the house. Dominic, for his part, could only stand there and absorb her fury, offering weak apologies that did nothing to stem the tide of her anger. As their argument reached a fever pitch, the front door opened, and Jessica walked in, stopping short at the scene before her. For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in a tableau of betrayal and guilt. "Jessica, how kind of you to join us. We were just discussing your affair with my husband." Jessica's eyes darted between Cassandra and Dominic, her mind racing to find a way out of this situation. Dominic, torn between the two sisters, tried to intervene. "Please, let's just calm down and talk about this rationally." His words only served to redirect Cassandra's fury. In a fit of rage, Cassandra grabbed a vase from the coffee table and hurled it across the room, narrowly missing Dominic's head. It shattered against the wall, the crash punctuating her words. The noise seemed to snap Jessica out of her defiant stance. For the first time, a flicker of remorse crossed her face. Dominic and Jessica exchanged a look of helpless guilt before slowly making their way to the door. As it closed behind them, Cassandra collapsed onto the sofa, her body racked with sobs. The life she had known, the future she had planned, it had all crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. As the storm raged outside, Cassandra's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, shame, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of loss. In that moment, she made a decision that would set in motion the final tragic act of this sordid drama. The bartender, a grizzled man named Hank, watched with growing concern as Cassandra knocked back drink after drink. He had seen his fair share of patrons drowning their sorrows, but something about the wild look in Cassandra's eyes set him on edge. "Another," Cassandra demanded, her words slightly slurred. Hank hesitated, but the steel in her gaze made him think better of refusing. He poured her another whiskey, neat, silently vowing it would be her last. As the night wore on, the bar emptied out, leaving Cassandra alone with her thoughts and her drinks. The alcohol had dulled the sharp edges of her pain, replacing it with a bitter resolve. Around midnight, Hank gently suggested it was time for her to head home. "Need me to call you a cab, miss?" Cassandra waved him off, fumbling in her purse for her car keys. "I'm fine," she insisted. "I just need to get out of here." Hank reached out to stop her, but Cassandra was already stumbling towards the door. As she stumbled into the parking lot, Cassandra managed to get her car started, the engine roaring to life in the quiet night. She pulled out of the parking lot, her vision blurred and her reactions dangerously slow. The winding coastal road stretched out before her, a ribbon of asphalt barely visible in the moonlight. As she drove, Cassandra's mind was a chaotic whirl of emotions: anger at Dominic and Jessica's betrayal, shame at not having seen the signs earlier, fear of the uncertain future that now lay ahead of her. The speedometer crept higher as she pressed down on the accelerator. It was on a particularly treacherous curve that disaster struck. Cassandra's dulled reflexes failed her, and she took the turn too fast. She felt the car begin to slide, tires screeching against the asphalt. In a moment of terrifying clarity, she realized her mistake, but it was too late.
The guardrail gave way with a sickening crunch of metal, and suddenly Cassandra was airborne. Then darkness consumed her as the car plummeted over the cliff's edge, tumbling end over end towards the jagged rocks below. The first rays of dawn were just breaking over the horizon when Officer Liam Murphy received the call. A jogger had spotted a wrecked car at the bottom of Whispering Cliffs, a notorious stretch of coastline. Murphy, a seasoned member of Millhaven's small police force, felt a sense of dread as he made his way to the scene. The sight that greeted him was grim. The car, a silver sedan, was barely recognizable, having been crushed by the impact and battered by the waves. As the rescue team worked to extract the vehicle from its precarious position, Murphy began the somber task of piecing together what had happened. The license plate, miraculously still intact, quickly identified the car as belonging to Cassandra Blunt. Murphy felt his heart sink. He knew Cassandra, as did most people in Millhaven. The thought of delivering this news to her family weighed heavily on him. As the morning progressed, and the full extent of the tragedy became clear, whispers began to circulate through the town. Cassandra Blunt, dead in what appeared to be a drunk driving accident? It seemed impossible, completely out of character for the woman everyone knew as responsible and level-headed. Detective Sarah Watson, called in from the nearest city to lead the investigation, sensed there was more to the story. Her keen eye noted details that didn't quite add up. The lack of skid marks on the road, suggesting no attempt to brake. The odd angle of the car's trajectory off the cliff. The fact that Cassandra had been drinking alone, something her friends swore she never did. When Watson arrived at the Blunt residence to break the news, she was struck by the palpable tension in the air. Dominic Blunt's reaction to his wife's death seemed oddly muted, tinged with guilt, and the presence of Jessica Lawrence, Cassandra's sister, in the house at such an early hour raised immediate red flags. In the days that followed Cassandra's death, Detective Watson immersed herself in the investigation, peeling back layers of Millhaven's seemingly idyllic surface to reveal the turmoil beneath. Her first step was to retrace Cassandra's final hours, a task that led her to the Rusty Anchor and its reluctant bartender, Hank. Hank's account of Cassandra's state on the night of her death painted a picture of a woman in deep emotional distress. She was knocking them back like there was no tomorrow, he told Watson. Guilt etched on his weathered face. I tried to stop her from driving. This testimony conflicted sharply with everything Watson had heard about Cassandra from friends and colleagues. The woman they described was cautious, responsible, not someone who would drink to excess and then get behind the wheel. The detective's suspicions deepened. Watson's next focus was on Dominic Blunt and Jessica Lawrence. Their behavior since Cassandra's death had been odd, to say the least. Instead of grieving separately, they seemed to be leaning on each other for support, their interactions marked by meaningful glances and hushed conversations that would abruptly cease when others approached. A breakthrough came when Watson interviewed Cassandra's closest friend, Olivia Chen. At first, Olivia was reluctant to speak ill of the dead or cause more pain to the family, but as Watson gently pressed, the floodgates opened. Cassandra had confided in me just days before it happened, Olivia admitted, her voice quavering. She suspected Dominic was having an affair with Jessica. This revelation cast the entire case in a new light. Watson immediately sought to corroborate this information, digging deeper into Dominic and Jessica's recent activities. Bank records showed suspicious transactions, hotel bookings, expensive gifts that aligned with times Dominic had claimed to be on business trips. As the evidence mounted, Watson brought Dominic and Jessica in for separate interviews. Under the detective's relentless questioning, their carefully constructed alibis began to crumble. It was Jessica who broke first. Yes, we were having an affair, she confessed, tears streaming down her face. Cassandra found out that night. We had a huge fight, all three of us. But I swear, we didn't know she'd left the house after we went. Dominic, confronted with Jessica's confession, finally admitted to the affair but vehemently denied any involvement in Cassandra's death. We made a terrible mistake, he said, his voice hollow with regret. But I loved Cassandra. I would never have wanted this. Watson believed they were telling the truth about not directly causing Cassandra's death, but she knew their actions had set the tragic events in motion. The detective's report painted a clear picture. Cassandra, distraught after discovering her husband's infidelity with her own sister, had sought solace in alcohol. Her decision to drive in that state, while ultimately her own,
was the direct result of the emotional trauma inflicted by Dominic and Jessica's betrayal. In the end, no criminal charges were filed in relation to Cassandra's death, but in the court of public opinion, Dominic and Jessica were already condemned. The truth of their affair spread through Millhaven like wildfire, forever tarnishing their reputations and ensuring that Cassandra's death would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As time passed, the raw pain of the events began to dull, but their impact on Millhaven remained. The town would eventually regain its outward appearance of tranquility, but its inhabitants carried with them the knowledge that beneath the calm surface of small-town life, passions and secrets could swirl with deadly force. The tragedy of Cassandra Blunt had forever changed the soul of Millhaven, leaving an indelible mark on all who called it home.